The Return Game. A Billionaire Boss Romance. Misha Quinn. Chapter 1. A young woman was driving around town in a red sports car with an open top. The woman's chin was proudly raised. A light chiffon scarf of orange flame flowed around her shoulders. There was a sense of self-confidence in the woman's appearance, her right to drive such a car, and her right to drive freely through the city center. The other people around her were running out of stuffy offices into the street and rushing to cafes for short lunch breaks. People sat choking on hastily chosen food, looking at their watches, while still trying to have a few words with their colleagues to maintain relationships. The car was small and familiar, but powerful and expensive. The sound of the engine was pleasingly colorful and bassy. In our time of electric motors, Ella still preferred a car with a gasoline engine in her possession. But the young woman only drove it sometimes. Instead, her private driver usually took her around in another car, a luxury limousine equipped with an electric motor. So now, guided by the confident hand of the young woman, her old but beautiful car drove through the streets of the metropolis and ran on the highways. Yes, now Ella could afford the best of everything. Everything she wanted financially. She earned it with her money, sweat, and nerves. All were honest. What she suddenly did was honest and open, too. The young woman stopped her car in the middle of the street, despite the honking of indignant drivers forced to stop behind her. The red car sparkled defiantly in the midday sun. Its reflection perfectly refreshed the glass facade of the huge office building, which towered over Ella, over the street, in a vast gray monolith, and seemed to make those who ventured to look up and appreciate its size cringe to the ground. Ella lifted herself from the seat, holding onto the steering wheel. She raised a hand in an elegant driver's light yellow perforated leather glove. Then, the young woman pointed a middle finger toward the gray building. Oversized sunglasses hid her eyes, but the woman's triumphant smile betrayed her delight that she could afford to express her disdain for the building and all that went with it. Yeah, Ella could not say she appreciated the place. Indeed, not the building or the company itself. No. Her past came over Ella when she saw the painfully familiar intersection. She drove up and saw how her first workplace was doing. Yes, no one or nothing was telling her what to do, how to act, or who she should love. Ella had grown up and was now managing her life how she wanted. However, the pain of the past still sometimes clutched at her chest. Like now. The young woman did not want to admit that the hope of seeing him, Graham, was still smoldering in her heart. So why drive past this corporation? Everything that symbolized that gray building to Ella was about Graham. Her love. All of that, along with the joys and sorrows, had passed. So now Ella had to think about how to build her life in the future. That was a pleasant thing to think about. After all, Ella had the money to afford everything she wanted, a great apartment downtown, a sports car, and the latest super gadgets. Yes, the young woman had everything except love. How and when did I turn into that lone wolf, or rather, she-wolf? Ella thought, as she drove away from the corporation building. It was so hard for me to understand what happened to us after Graham left me alone on the morning of our wedding night. Did I understand anything? A man is like a dark forest. The further one delves into his motives, the darker the brain becomes. Is it so simple that there is no further to go? There is a widespread belief that men are so simple that women consider the reasons for their actions. Why is that? Because many women find it hard to believe that them. A man prefers fishing or hockey. Despite their reconciliation in Montreux, Switzerland, Graham preferred his new hobby to his young wife. He was still working for the country's secret service. That was when Ella's patience snapped. She decided she would never wait for any favors from Graham or anyone else again. With such thoughts, Ella drove through the crowded streets from the office center to her neighborhood, where her apartment was located. The building where Ella bought the apartment for almost $1.5 million was in a prestigious district in the heart of this immense peninsula. The tower was built in the first half of the 20th century, and all its architecture and decorations breathed Art Deco chic. When Ella entered the apartment after the realtor, a breathtaking view of the vast park and the surrounding neighborhood caught her eye. The young woman felt right away she had always lived here. The apartment had a good layout, in Ella's opinion. Each room had a window, which made it stand out from many other flats offered in the old buildings of the metropolis. When Ella saw the kitchen, which also had a window overlooking the park, the young woman knew that this was what she needed. Ella sometimes thought she had some claustrophobia. She avoided driving into underground parking lots and preferred places with a good view of the surrounding expanse. A broad balcony with cozy sofas and tables surrounded the apartment on the top floor of the building. Here and there, carelessly arranged simple wooden chairs lent a chic touch to everyday enjoyment of the view, not just comfort. The balcony was accessible from any apartment room, a rarity even in this upscale neighborhood. There was also a small gym on the sundeck. The previous owner wanted to avoid going to the shared gym of the building. Instead, they preferred to exercise on the balcony. Inside, the apartment was completely renovated. There was new wallpaper on the walls, contemporary furniture in the Art Deco style, and impressive chandeliers, the most famous designers of that time. Everything in the apartment breathed that era, so much so that any of its owners would not dare to remake it in a modern way. So instead, the building set the tone for the whole place, which pleased Ella. The young businesswoman paid the entire apartment price all at once. Ella moved here immediately. All further renovation of the apartments was done later, step by step. The neighborhood was well maintained, and it pleased Ella enough to stroll through it with her dogs, Pomeranians Mati and Tommy, early in the morning and late at night. In the evenings, of course, it bothered little to go out at night with such small dogs though. However, Ella cared more about being able to keep her dogs at home than she did about the charms of the surrounding area, with its access to the Central Park, museums, boutiques, and other places of interest in the city. Ella was now free of all obligations in business, having sold it for a great price. She felt so easy and simple, without the daily worries of company business that the young woman had just lived. Then, after 5 years of intense struggle to survive in business and her personal life, Ella had that long-awaited vacation. After walking into the lobby of the house, decorated with the beautiful ornaments of its era, Ella staggered easily across its yellowish but still chic marble floor to the elevator. The elevator carried her up to her floor. Stepping out of the elevator, Ella immediately heard the joyful barks of her pets. Ella opened the door, and 2 furry balls pounced on her. Tiny Pomeranians greeted her, showing all their love. The dogs jumped happily around Ella so that she dropped her bag on the bench in the hallway, and took off her shoes, kneeled on them, rubbed their backs, scratched their ears, and took them outside for a walk before they ate. The woman freed the dogs from their harnesses and prepared their food in the kitchen. Both Pomeranians sat at her feet and watched intently as Ella put the pate into their bowls. As soon as the food was on their feeding mat, the spies pounced on it as if she had not fed them all week. Oh ho, those Pomeranians. They were very food-driven rescue dogs. A year ago, a friend asked if Ella would like to help rehoming 2 adult dogs from the shelter. The young woman accepted the pets until they found a permanent owner or owner. Her heart just melted when she saw those 2 little lumps of fluff with their lively button eyes and pointed ears sticking out of their fur. Ella fell in love with them at first sight. A month later, she told the shelter that she had kept them permanently. It was not an easy decision, as she was often stuck at work and needed to consider herself capable of devoting her time to anything or anyone but her business. However, after learning the easygoing nature of dogs, Ella realized she could sometimes take them with her to work. They helped her to entertain and relieve her visitors. The two fluffy dogs adored their new owner, and she loved them too. The need to take care of the pets gradually turned Ella's into a firm belief that life goes on and work will go nowhere. When the young woman came home, she met with such happy faces that all other concerns remained outside the house. Only dogs can be so delighted when their master comes home. They look you in the eyes, and you feel how they were waiting for you, how glad they are to see you. But of course, they still hope they will be taken out for a walk, and then they will get a piece of that delicious sausage from the fridge. Ella has had many fans lately. But of course, when you get a lot of money, you get many admirers. Even if you are not the prettiest of the other young women. Yes, Ella was pretty, but not beautiful. She got used to this definition of herself long ago. Ella was not driven out of her mind by the occasional critique comments from her friends or acquaintances about her appearance. Only Ella's parents were sure their daughter was the most beautiful and clever girl in the world, whom even Graham did not deserve. Yes, Ella was not beautiful. But whether the external beauty of the matter, if you are beautiful at heart. Many need to understand why she was so relaxed about cosmetics and did not pursue fashion. She still picked up such a man as a handsome, clever billionaire, Graham. It caused among her friends women if not open envy, then she was perplexed. When Ella got her own business and had more money at her disposal, the exaggerated attention of those around her, both men and women, pissed off the introverted Ella. When she was a nobody, her lover Graham chose her as a guinea pig for his purposes at the corporation, thinking she was not going anywhere from him. But she was not as easy as he thought. He, a rich poor guy, fell in love with her, for real, as much as anyone could have imagined. They were married, and then, despite a beautiful and romantic truce, got back together and still separated again. And they were divorced. Ella took nothing of his vast fortune, on principle. Her life was ahead of her. She was sure she could live without his money. She wanted to prove it to him. She had never liked his money, even if it was on the way to her lost happiness. She wanted only his feelings for her. After her divorce, Ella put something else on her mind besides her worries and tried to set up her own business. The young woman went on an entrepreneurial course, and there she chose a project for home delivery, which already seemed quite relevant to her 5 years ago. Ella got the knowledge and support of the foundations and companies. She started organizing the delivery process and working with clients. Last year, given the pandemic virus, her venture suddenly took off on the upswing of a home delivery startup. When the young woman realized she no longer wanted to devote her time solely to a business that was not her dream, or something she would do without the monetary reward, Ella explored every opportunity to get the best price in selling the company. After listing the company herself, she turned down many offers, conducted a successful IPO within the time allowed by law and her management contract, sold her stake, and walked away from the company. So now Ella was living utterly independently of Graham and his requirements. She did not even know where he was or what was wrong with him. The young woman did not want to know anything about her ex-husband. She switched or even turned off the TV when movies about special agents appeared. The subject got on her nerves. It seemed to Ella that the image of Graham was about to appear in the picture, even though the actors looked nothing like him. However, how could any one actor compare to the handsome Graham, 6 feet and 4 inches tall, all made of steel muscles and an irresistible charm? Women fought for the right to catch his gaze, or to spend at least 5 minutes with him, looking into his unusually blue eyes, surrounded by long black lashes. With Graham's hair the color of the golden ears of an August wheat field, this rare combination drove women crazy. Seeing his strength and charm, men usually recognized him as a leader at once, and, having lost a skirmish with him in advance, tried to get his attention and trust. She remembered how Graham had put down a drunken man at one party by simply turning to him and ordering him in a commanding voice to leave the bar. Somehow, the bully did not pick a fight but backed up and walked away. This ability to assess the situation correctly brought Graham his fortune in business and respect in business circles. Also, this ability led him to that unique service where he began investigating financial crimes against his country. These thoughts about Graham. I should forget him, forget forever, the young woman thought, looking at the stunning view. I got my life back, I have all this, and I am still desperate about Graham. Ella turned, walked back into the room, sat in an ornate armchair with gracefully curved legs, and watched the flames of the cold artificial fire dancing in the fireplace. Ella, who had deleted all of Graham's photos from her phone and databank, did not want to see or hear anything about him. And these films. She feared a wave of feelings would come over her, like when she realized Graham would not give up his new job, despite his enormous fortune. Yes, he too was looking for a conscience in life. But in his opinion, Graham found it responsible and necessary to society at that moment, but consumed all his time and energy in serving the state. So much not interested in a former spouse's life can only be when there is still hope in the soul that not all is lost. Still, it is impossible to admit this, even to himself. Ella tormented the other men, who tried to show her signs of attention, intolerance, and harshness. Women pity her, mixed with envy. Men considered her a bitch with money. But, of course, she was a bitch with a lot of money, which made her even more attractive. When the contented dogs had gone to their beds, Ella opened the sliding frames of the balcony door. She stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the refreshing evening air. Everything was okay with her now. Yes, everything was fine except for Ella's personal life. She did not have one. Whether Ella wanted it, Graham still held the central place in her heart that other men hoped to have. So what can she do with those feelings for Graham? Ella still did not find the answer to this question. Chapter 2. Graham held his finger over the enter key. The strain of the last few days was taking its toll. The man's forehead was covered in sweat, all the muscles of his body were trembling finely. But the mighty body of the strong man resisted with all his might the stress that had become the norm for him and his comrades in arms. During active operations, the country's Special Service Financial Unit did not count working hours, and the coffee cups were not drunk at all. The level of the fear hormone, adrenaline, was off the scale. However, it was not fear. Instead, the stress level in its active hit-or-run stage was passing. Since the tasks were not solved overnight, further exposure to high stress levels increased cortisol. Cortisol is a long-term stress hormone produced by constantly overstraining all the body's reserves on stressful tasks. Graham knew all this, so it did not bother him that sleep receded into the background like many of his colleagues. Where is their target? Why do they not see anything on the computer screen? How long does he have to wait before he can do what they have been preparing for all these last weeks of operation against money laundering and withdrawal from the country? A line of program entries flashed on the screen, giving them access to one perpetrator's bank accounts. Yes. Let us go, exclaimed Graham, and in his direction, many miles away from their office, the assault team burst into the basement room. They were met by stunned young men who could never escape from their spinning chairs, chained to them by orders and the muzzles of the Special Forces machine guns. The nest of swindlers, who had robbed both the citizens of the country and had arranged sabotage against the level of the country's currency on the world markets, was taken without too much noise and too many losses. Graham tiredly took off his headphones, stood up, stretched, and said to his colleagues, "That is it. Dawn is in command now. I am off to bed." He turned and walked out of the stuffy room, to the applause of his colleagues and subordinates. He wanted the air, to stretch his stiff legs, swing his arms, and inhale the scent of the sycamores. September greeted him with the warm rays of the gentle sun and the rustle of the dry leaves falling from the trees. The slightly stuffy but pleasant smell of fallen leaves, a golden carpet of leaves along the park paths to which Graham strolled, finally gave him the solace he had longed for lately. Graham felt like his life was going somewhere like a fast train. He needed to find out where the destination of this train was. Yes, Graham had chosen his way. He was doing what he considered extraordinarily important for himself and his country. What was happening to the rest of his life? That was something Graham had tried not to think about in recent years. What more could one expect? So would many of those who knew Graham or observed his life, at least from afar. Graham was a billionaire, but not one for whom money is an end. So many people strive for money, thinking it will improve their lives. Yes, up to a certain level, it does. But at some point, the money could have been more attractive for a long time. At some level of family affluence, something must remain at the dream level. When anything or any service is purchasable, life loses interest. If Graham had not engaged in activities to benefit the country where he was born, he does not know how he would have lived. So is membership in certain level clubs, expensive cars, and women covered with diamonds. Is this a limit of dreams? Dreams of too many people, about how to get massive amounts of money at their disposal. Graham knew that money comes with responsibility. Responsibility for how you use it. Accountability for how you teach your children how to use it. Yes, Graham had not thought about children yet. What children, if his only and beloved wife had left him? The image of Ella rose before Graham's inner eye. He was walking down the park alley and bumped into her sitting on a bench. The sun plays in her dark curly hair. She lifts her head from the book she is reading and, squinting against the sun, looks up at Graham with a smile. Or he imagined how Ella was walking through his mansion, homely, painfully beautiful in her pajamas and barefoot slippers. Then, she was standing at the kitchen stove, preparing her breakfast. When Graham suddenly sneaked up and embraced her, she did not flinch in surprise, but looked up at him adoringly from below. When was all this? Graham shuddered, shook his head, and looked around. Yeah, his personal life was going nowhere, unlike his job. He knew he was making himself forget he had no life outside this team by being super active in his unit's operations. He had no life without Ella. What divorced them? His selfishness. His fixation on the fact that choosing this occupation was the only alternative to the now dull lifestyle of a very wealthy man. Graham was fed up with his ability to buy anything he wanted. Ella showed him that true feelings could not be purchased. This pure and, at first, naive girl taught him you do not have to pay to get intense attention and respect. Now Graham needed sleep, though it was only the middle of the day. Taking another deep breath, the man continued his walk along the park's alleys. He walked with his hands in the pockets of his relatively wide trousers. He did not like tight clothes. Despite the fashion of recent years, he did not need to tighten anything about his figure to stand out from the crowd of men. He was all good looks, and he knew it well. His parents' private school instilled the classic style of dress in him as a child, who invested all their savings into his education. Coming from a middle-class family, Graham had learned in middle school that you had to stand out. To stand out, not by bullying as some boys thought, and by empty bravado, but by achievement. He signed up for his school's basketball team and excelled in every competition. Many colleges were after him for his test scores and athletic accomplishments. It was rare for a guy his age to be an excellent student and a great athlete. The girls just adored him. He did not deny them attention. However, his romances never amounted to anything substantial. Graham always felt something was missing in the relationship. Perhaps too much adoration of young women confused him. He felt nothing in himself for which he could be so wanted. The young man did not realize then how handsome he was. Graham knew he was intelligent and athletic, and he only thought about his masculine attractiveness when he got a job at a well-known international corporation after his brilliant graduation from college and completion of his amateur basketball studies. That was when Graham realized the effect of his masculine good looks and a promising career on women. Graham learned how to use his best qualities to get women to do whatever he wanted. Graham, of course, still made occasional mistakes, but small enough not to lose face in business. He learned to use people to his advantage. By the time Graham met Ella, he was already a mature wolf. A wolf in harm's way, as he would have put it. The uncanny ability to draw people in and immerse himself in their needs, getting them to do anything, or almost anything, for him in return, showed Graham that he was nearly a demigod among mortals. He did not want to think so, but when he passed all levels of management in 5 years at a corporation, the company's owners, appreciating his ability to negotiate and manage projects, chose him for the company's CEO position. From that moment, his growth as a businessperson began. Graham earned millions a year and invested his money as if it were someone else's, not his. He made only informed decisions, not expecting the mercy of the stock exchange roulette or other ways to increase the money supply quickly. He knew very well that as the opportunity of winning increases, so does the chance of losing. Gambling had never attracted him. So, Graham tried to leave his emotions and momentary desires aside, developing his position in the company and his capital. First, as CEO of the company, he was given an option for the next 5 years on the condition that the value of his share should increase as he navigated the company through the turbulent waters of the business ocean. Well, these were all allegories. In reality, the CEO had to be eager to go with all his pitchforks so that the money he formalized as company shares grew along with the company's value, even though it had not yet been floated on the stock exchange. In the first 5 years, Graham tripled the company's profits, so his share of the stock potentially tripled from its original valuation. Receiving millions each year for his work as CEO, Graham was very stingy about spending money on himself. He did not have a family yet, and his parents wanted nothing special. They were used to middle-class life and even afraid to go beyond it. So, Graham did not consider it necessary to spend money on women. He realized early on that he did not need to spend money on women. Many of them expected they needed nothing now, but then when they got their hands on him, as a husband, which is when everything would be. However, Graham was in no hurry to be caught in the net of love, much less marriage. He was young, he had everything ahead of him, and wanted to build capital and think about a family. After 10 years at the company, Graham became a billionaire. The stock exchange raised his shareholding so high that 6 months after going public, he sold his shareholding at a great price, while the market valued his corporation as a promising investment. So Graham first became a multi-millionaire. Then, after bringing the huge corporation to the stock exchange and conducting its successful IPO, he became a billionaire. Many people formed married couples at the same corporation, despite the unspoken ban on having relationships with coworkers. People did not give a damn about any rules if feelings took over. The ban on relationships was motivated because it will be hard for you to work together later if you become a couple or if you simply break up, and there is no telling which is harder to endure. But of course, this was the joke of the corporation's executives when they had to instruct the newcomers to the corporation or remind their pushy comrades in arms about this etiquette. Ella had met Graham Anderson when he was the CEO of the company and the main shareholder there. Such a halt when she came to work for the corporation, which Graham was then in charge of. Noticing her naivety and youthfulness, Graham was interested in her, but only because he just wanted to use her as the eyes and ears of his corporation. The CEO wanted to play his "I like you, let us talk straight, everything as it is as you think" games with such a newcomer as Ella was then. Unfortunately, some people he would previously charm eventually woke up to his charisma and stopped believing in his sincere intentions to maintain a relationship with them for the sake of liking them personally. Graham needed the opinion of a new person, who turned out to be this girl, Ella. Graham thought he would have fooled her quickly, but he was unprepared because he would have to listen to this girl's sincere opinion. He was used to all the information that came to him through the corporation, which was always softened or turned upside down altogether. He found it hard to believe this girl was openly telling him everything, and her feelings for him. She demanded that he treat her the same way. Graham was trapped in his habits and limitations, and floundered between his feelings for Ella and his intentions to use her as a source of information and discard her for lack of use. He had seen the adoration of women before her. It had always been tied to some benefit of what they would enter a relationship with him: money, connections, or marriage to a wealthy man. This brat wanted nothing, or understood nothing about life yet. Graham was caught in the net of genuine sincerity and love. Until now, he had not known what it meant to love. But here, every glance at Ella, every touch on her skin, gave him a shiver of desire to kiss and caress her. He did not know what to do about it. This relationship went against his principles of not mixing work and personal life, and the principles of the corporation based on the same. All in a blur of memories, Graham did not notice how he found himself in front of the door of his house. He was renting an apartment in one of the new condominiums in the area. The building had only recently been built, and many of the flats had been purchased or rented to celebrities. Graham occasionally bumped into some of them in the elevator. Women would give him approvingly appreciative looks, and men would look at him with envy and incomprehension at what he was doing here in such plain clothes. Means something other than cheap. It is just that many celebrities' styles of dress meant wearing the artwork of fashion designers as an advertisement for themselves or that clothing brand. Graham now dressed conservatively but inexpensively. After he went to work for the Secret Service, he adopted the style of his colleagues: everyday clothes of quiet tones, which in no way stood out from the crowd. But of course, it was hard not to notice such a man. With his 6 feet, 5 inches in height and good looks, Graham was not worried that inconspicuous clothes would make him discreet too. Graham walked down the building hall, took the elevator to his floor, and entered his apartment. The view of the bay and its opposite shore opened before him. The setting sun illuminated his apartment with its warm rays. Everything in it had taken on the color of fresh honey. The sun's rays streamed higher and higher up the walls. The sun was setting, and everything had turned an almost purple hue. At last the clouds on the horizon hid the circle of the sun, and blue darkness set in, which gradually turned into a velvet night. There should have been stars shining in the sky. Still, the lights of the metropolis cut through everything around with a glow, and the atmosphere was dark, but not dark enough for the stars to be discernible. Graham finally woke up from the trance he had been in, since that crucial operation to capture the criminals had ended. The strain of the last few days had taken its toll, and he headed for the shower, the jets of water refreshing his tired body. Graham, hastily towel-drying his lean-toned body, walked to the bedroom and with a groan sank on the wide bed. The lilac silk sheets embraced him, and he drifted off into the absolute darkness, the darkness of sleep. Chapter 3. A young woman woke up, sat on the bed, and took her phone from the table. The device was the latest model of one of the best brands, and shone with a colorful wrapper tastefully decorated with rhinestones. The woman lightly shook the machine, saw it ring unanswered, and putting the phone aside, headed for the bathroom. Back in the bedroom, already dressed in comfortable loose home clothes and thoroughly combed after her shower, Ella jabbed her finger at the phone screen, putting it on speakerphone. The caller answered, and a high female voice rang out on the speaker. "Hello, hello. How are you?" Ella replied. "Okay, great. I am fine. How are you?" "I am fine, thanks. Do you remember, we are going to a jazz club tonight? What are you going to wear?" Ella said. "Tonight? What are you? Of course I will be there. Did we say we would entertain them? Well, we will take our own time. I am sorry. We will have fun." The woman on the phone continued. "Come on, how many times can we talk about work? We should rest," her acquaintance objected in feigned indignation. "Yes, I only think about work. Although you remember, I do not work anymore. Yeah, remind yourself of that sometimes. Well, let's meet in front of the club. Do you remember the address, right?" "Yes." "Okay. I will take a cab. A light cocktail is something I can have. A total teetotaler is not me. I will meet you at 9 o'clock, okay? All right, I will see you then. Bye." Ella's mocking voice betrayed her embarrassment. Everyone around her knew she hardly ever drank alcohol, and avoided company where drinking was the norm. So, she always had to apologize to her acquaintances because no one saw her drinking well. Well, it is a good thing they did not. The last person who saw her like that was Graham. Ella forced herself to focus on something else, to keep her mind off her ex-spouse. They had not met in years, but she remembered his dark blue eyes, hands, and body. The young woman still placed his kisses, his love. This embarrassed her, and Ella got rid of the memories, at least for a while. That is it. I had to get this over with, she thought, looking around to find what to do next. Then, suddenly, she looked at the vacuum cleaner. Yes, this is a good thing to do now, cleaning, she thought, inhaling with relief. Ella started cleaning her apartment, humming a popular tune and briskly vacuuming the floors with a lightweight, super-modern vacuum cleaner. The young woman liked to do everything in her house, which helped to take her mind off any unnecessary thoughts. Had it not been for that call, she would have completely forgotten that she had arranged with her acquaintances to spend the evening with their friends at one of the jazz clubs in the city. Ella loved the atmosphere of small jazz clubs. Everything breathed with authentic music, close to you both spiritually and physically. The musicians played on the small stage before you, and you felt like a team member. This unique atmosphere attracted people who wanted to get closer to the magic of live music birth. The time flew by while Ella was doing her chores. Then, finally, she finished cleaning, wiped the dust off all the surfaces in her apartment, and satisfied, sat down on the couch. Ella glanced at the clock and thought, "Wow, it is already approaching 5 o'clock in the evening. I have to get ready to go out." Though it would be a couple of hours before she needed to be there, the young woman knew that taxis of the day were sometimes hard to get after work, and she preferred other services. The official yellow taxi was more trustworthy. After all, she was a woman and did not want to get into a car with someone she did not know. At least, she did not want to get into a car with someone she did not know. Ella took a shower, smoothed her knotty curls a little, and as always, shook them proudly, looked at her reflection in the mirror. Who am I? What do I want out of my life? Why do I not still have a family? It was her past's entire fault. Her ambition was to prove to herself and everyone around her she did not need her ex-husband's grace. That could be the main reason for her stubborn independence and the problem of starting a new family. Perhaps the problem was that Ella needed to be less critical of men. But no, she constantly rejected many overt and covert offers to have an affair with her. Then, of course, some relationship initiatives came from men and a couple of women. There was no way she would have expected that, but now anything was possible. Ella was not overreacting because she still had no one in her life. But her parents' quiet nagging that they were getting old and still wanted to see and babysit their grandchildren before they died was slowly pushing Ella into a new relationship. But what would they be? Ella tore her gaze away from her image in the mirror and, splashing some expensive perfume on the skin of her neck, went to the dressing room to get dressed. For this evening, the young woman had chosen a super tight dress of fabric that shimmered in every shade of gold. Made of flowing fabric, it fell in a semicircle over her breasts and then just sat on her body like a glove. The dress hid nothing except that Ella's breasts were not a noticeable part of her body. This was a little embarrassing for Ella. Still, she had seen many women's bodies change as they aged, especially after having children. Then, breasts could get quite large. Now, well, let it be as life had given her. Despite the abundance of money, Ella never wanted to have plastic surgery. If there were any reason because of her health, she would not be afraid of surgery. But for the sake of getting men to look at you more or increase self-esteem, no, Ella would not risk her health for that. Meanwhile, thinking about women and their burdens, Ella sat on the couch and wore thin, flesh-colored tights. Then she chose high-heeled shoes, which were almost classic pumps and gold. Ella could not stand stockings, because they would slip at the most inopportune moment. Also, with the tight clothing of recent years, it was challenging to wear them without demonstrating their presence. Or rather, their garter or stocking belt. Ella did not like overt sexuality. Raised in a traditional family, she preferred to leave her sexual chewing to the bedroom. However, having spent her first and subsequent nights with Graham, she never regretted it. Dressed in a gold dress and shoes, Ella picked up a small red evening purse and stopped at a large mirror as she prepared to leave for the taxi she had ordered to her driveway. She regarded the slender young woman standing before her in a tight golden outfit like a golden statue. A red handbag on a gold chain gave her the look of a figurine from the time of the Egyptian pharaohs. Ella burst out laughing, shook her head, and putting red lipstick on her lips, walked out of the apartment. A taxi took Ella to a jazz club near the bay. Everyone knew it as a place where new musicians could be heard. Young musicians could find patrons or sponsors for their careers among the listeners. Ella was one of the first to enter the club. She stopped at the bar and ordered a fresh strawberry-flavored cocktail, her favorite treat. Sipping her drink from a strawberry, Ella stood at the bar and quietly looked around the small room of the club. The small semi-basement room gradually filled with visitors. First, some men, obviously single, looked at Ella, who was standing lonely at the side of the stage, with interest and even appeal. Then her friend and their companions, two still young men, appeared, and Ella's group became balanced. Nobody looked at her anymore, as at an object that should be immediately picked up. Yes, a woman without a companion in a place like this had so far aroused too much interest in men. Ella wondered, what if she were a man and came to a woman-only club? How would the ladies behave with her? Probably the same way. They would think she was looking for someone here. The jazz bar was not a place a decent woman should go without a companion. The chief, a former colleague and mentor of Ella's, an old acquaintance from the days of the corporation that Graham had headed, came through the doorway. The chief was a pre-retirement man, tall, with a large head and a high forehead, adorned with an unruly mop of gray spikes. He had previously served as a mentor to Ella in the corporation. Since Graham and Ella had married, divorced, and then Ella started her own business, the chief had enjoyed maintaining an easy buddy relationship with her. He liked Ella's independent type of thinking. Although the chief always tried to belittle women's opinions in conversation at first, such splinters as Ella, who never had a problem expressing her opinion on business matters directly, immediately put him in his place. Perhaps he even liked it. The chief fulfilled a mentor role in his and Graham's relations by giving advice. In return, he enjoyed being penetrated by the sharpness of the young lover's problems and feelings. After all, his love adventures were far in the past. At least, that is what everyone around him thought. Finally, Ella's friend arrived and brought their guests, two middle-aged business people, to visit their metropolis. The evening began. Musicians were playing their instruments. The sounds of jazz flew into the club space from the small stage, and permeated everything around them with their ineffable charm. The chief was sipping his favorite beer. Two people were chatting with another person. Everyone around was singing and dancing, or so it seemed to Ella. Holding her cocktail in her hand, she was singing and dancing too. First, however, the young woman remembered to pull up the hem of her dress, which tried to stand higher and higher on her feet. Their guests were engrossed in the evening's music and atmosphere. Ella hoped her friend would not return to her apartment alone. Perhaps she would find a mate in one of their guests. However, Ella did not want any new relationship. So after gently removing the other guest's hand from her lap twice, she went out to freshen up and put the evening down. After all, Ella only had a business relationship with these men, which they refused to understand. When their attempts to have a relationship with this young woman were denied, they thought Ella was interested in women. Well, she thought, let them believe what they want. A new romantic melody played. Ella stood up carefully, trying not to stumble, turned away from the stage, and tripping over someone's leg almost flew down to the floor. Suddenly, the young woman felt someone's strong hands pick her up and bring her back to her feet. Ella never had time to fall, actually. Instead, she, almost out of breath, lifted her face. Graham stood before Ella, both hands on her shoulders as if he feared she might fall again. A sharp joy pierced the young woman, then replaced by panic. All these emotions were at once reflected on her face. Graham saw her reaction and hugged her tighter, pulling her against his chest as if they were still a couple. Her hands trembled, and her legs wobbled again. The woman almost fainted. Graham noticed her condition, and picking her up in his arms, carried her to the airy exit of the club. Still standing to the side, the chief watched Graham and Ella with great satisfaction. He knew this young woman would react in some unique way to Graham's appearance in front of her, but to faint like this. Such strength of feeling for Graham, the chief had not expected at all. The chief remembered how Graham contacted him a week ago, asking how to find Ella so he would not have to show up at her house. Then, the chief realized Graham was determined to act and bring their love story to its logical conclusion. When two people who loved each other split up over a misunderstanding of what had happened to the couple, they would meet again. Why? Because their story had yet to be told to the end, the chief thought. After receiving information about Ella's plans to go to a jazz club with her acquaintances, Graham asked him what his ex-wife planned to do after that jazz club. The chief admitted Ella would probably go home to sleep as usual. Everyone knew Ella had no one man in her life. There was no one after Graham. Graham also knew this. He wanted to be her sole possessor, like any man who still had feelings for a woman. This sense of ownership towards a family partner sometimes exceeds all reasonable limits. It is not jealousy, no. As some psychologists believe, envy comes from feeling unappreciated by your partner and those around you, perhaps false. Instead, the feeling of ownership comes from the traditions of the family. The family in which the man usually owns the woman gives her the best things in life, at least for a while. But in fact, she demands full accountability of all her affairs, personal money, affairs schedules, meetings, if there are any, and so on. This sense of ownership was also inherent in many women. However, if she felt anything like that, Ella never showed it to Graham or those around her. However, Graham did not want to think that he was possessive. He gave Ella everything other women could only dream of: money, freedom of choice, and his love. She gave up money and freedom of choice. But Graham hoped Ella kept pursuing his passion. Graham's love could not overcome the feeling of being bought by this strange, independent young woman. With these thoughts in mind, Graham arrived at the jazz club half an hour ago, and he was holding Ella in his arms. Graham was no angel, and needed sex. So, there were women, but only temporarily, because Ella was in his life forever. Graham felt that way, and so he found her. But it was time to make their situation clear. Ella could not live like a lonely woman. Graham felt guilty that she could not see everyday life. Why did the woman of his life, Ella, have to kill herself at work and prove she could make a fortune alone? He gave her everything once. If that was what she wanted, fine. That did not mean she could not be with him. That is what Graham wanted to find out. Chapter 4. Now, holding Ella in his arms, he saw she was almost unconscious from the stuffiness of the club and the unexpected encounter with her past love. Graham stood at the club's door, spreading his legs wide and gripping the still, half-emotionless young woman tightly to his chest. The fresh breeze from the bay was blowing on his heated body. Everything in him sang with joy. Ella was his. His. Who else would react like that to someone right in front of her? She harbored feelings for him, and their love had gone nowhere. He knew it. He knew it. The wind, fate, and people were all around him. Graham lifted Ella higher in his arms and kissed her forehead. The young woman opened her eyes and immediately rested her hand on his chest, trying to pull away. "Let me go. Now," Ella shrieked. She swung her legs like a schoolchild trying to get off a chair too high. Graham held her tightly in his arms, preventing her from falling to the ground. He stared at her face, as if searching for an answer to an unspoken question. "How beautiful and independent you have become without me. But do you still love me?" Ella was panicked by this proximity to his body, and the woman tried to move away from Graham. Still, her strength was unequal, and he remained the master of the situation. "Is that how you show who is stronger?" Ella exclaimed with almost childish resentment. "Let me go. I said, let me go." She panted indignantly and tried to pull his face away from hers but failed. Then, realizing that her attempts to get on the ground had failed, the young woman pretended to be resigned and relaxed. That was where Graham finally brought her down to earth. "So, are you showing me who is the boss again?" Only Ella's voice trembled, not with anger, but with dismay at the intensity with which the sensation of tenderness and warmth came over her. The closeness of his body and lips. This situation would inevitably lead her to want to kiss Graham, and there was no way she could let that happen. Ella's feelings were mixed, and she thought, "How could he have come to this evening without warning me?" I almost fainted, bumping into him on the dance's dark floor. Ella, pulling down the pulled-up hem of her short dress, mumbled confusedly without looking at Graham. "Well, how could you do that? I told you not to show up at the same companies where I spend my time." Graham, looking fondly at her, replied. "And when did we last meet at a friend's or acquaintance's party?" The woman was silent, lowering her gaze. Graham continued. "I have not bothered you in 3 years. Why don't you ask me how I am doing?" Ella was embarrassed. "Why do not you ask me how I am doing?" She embraced you. Graham realized an argument was about to break out. He changed the subject. "You look so beautiful in that dress. All the men were looking at you, so I could not stand it. I had to come closer and help you stay on your feet." "What a cheeky fellow you are!" Ella exclaimed. "First, you grab hold of me and then pretend to save me from falling." Graham took a step back from her and whispered. "If that is how you feel about me, we should break up. I am sorry I bothered you. I hoped you could still talk normally without being sarcastic or annoying." Saying that Graham already knew it was about to be decided, Ella would surge with indignation or accept his attitude. "Oh, lovely," she replied calmly, already looking at him with a smile. "Since we met so unexpectedly, let us take a walk and talk. I will not fight at all, it is just out of the blue. I am sorry." Graham sighed in relief, touched her arm lightly just above her elbow, and asked quietly, "You will not refuse to walk with me under your arm? Do you believe I will not hold you forcibly any longer?" There was a note of apology in his voice, and Ella, used to his obscurity, appreciated Graham's effort to apologize. Ella, taking him under her arm a little picturesquely, and looking slyly up from below, replied, "I believe and will not refuse to walk under my arm, my prince." Graham had not expected the warm tone in her voice. He could have jumped to the moon with happiness right now, like a boy who had gotten his girlfriend's approval on a first date. Ella, that prideful girl, his favorite prideful girl, was even talking to him. He had thought it would be much worse. Perhaps she still felt something for him. The couple strolled away from the club down the street, overhung by the crowns of old sprawling trees. The nightbirds whistled something romantic in the darkness, and the sense of the warm summer night seeped into the street, poorly lit by the tall and rather faint streetlights. Ella broke the silence. "So what do you do now?" she asked, stepping with Graham's hand through the night alley. Graham quieted for a moment, and then said deceptively nonchalantly, "Same thing. I work for the government." "Yeah. I thought it would be over quickly." "What did you expect me to do?" he asked interestedly. "I thought you got married and had kids. You have a fancy mansion decorated by the best modern decorators. Many cars for the whole family. You go to a private golf club, where you sometimes linger for a couple or 3 beers after a competition." Ella whispered. "Well, I have not met your expectations apparently," Graham continued. "I do not even own the mansion you lived in after we married. I sold it right after we got divorced." "Why?" Ella asked dazedly. "Because of me. Because of us. You could still have a normal life. But you did not say if you had a family." "I have no other family," Graham replied, looking straight ahead. Everything trembled in Ella's chest, her heart felt like it jumped in her chest and froze. "I have my parents," Graham continued, looking into Ella's eyes. "And so far that has been enough, before you." "Well, do not start," the young woman almost cried, pleading. "We cannot talk like this after what happened." Graham was already looking straight at her and stopped, turning Ella around to face her. "Do you still remember that night?" he said in a muffled voice. "I am trying to forget." "Then you are the lucky one." I will never forget the pain of losing a child. Our baby. Ella turned away from him and stared into the darkness, holding back her sobs. Graham hugged her lightly and gently and pressed her against his chest, saying, "Come on, baby. Why have you never talked to me about this? How do I know how you feel? Be straight with me. You know men do not understand misunderstandings." The young woman, wrapping both arms around his waist, pressed her whole body against his. There was nothing sexual in this embrace, just a search for warmth and understanding. Graham understood that just holding her with both hands, feeling his shirt getting wet and warm from Ella's tears. Finally, Ella calmed down, and wiping away her tears and sniffling her nose, asked him, "I am so intemperate. I rarely cry like this. And because I have never asked you how you feel either." Not knowing what to say to her, Graham tried to smooth the subject over. "You know I am in pain, but not like you. I cannot understand a fraction of what you felt and are feeling. I am sorry I could not support you in that situation. You know what the doctors said happens to many people. Some natural causes cause a baby in the first 3 months from conception to survive or not. Our baby did not survive. It is not your fault or mine that nature did." Ella pulled away from Graham slightly and answered, looking him in the eye. "It was really hard for me. It was not as physically painful when your body rejects your child, as it was unsure why it happened to us." Graham hugged her tighter and stroked Ella's shoulders soothingly as if to lull her into his arms. "I never thought it was that hard for you. I thought it happens to many people, and people get back to normal and have more kids." Ella looked up at him. "Yeah, but there is another problem that comes to mind. We would have divorced anyway. You were too active in arranging my life by deciding what I did, what I wore, whom I talked to, and what was in my purse." Graham rejoiced at the opportunity to change the subject from one that was hard for both of them, and faked an indignant objection. "So what of it? I just wanted you to have the best of everything." The woman, still in his arms, replied, "Well, yes, everything is the best, and for me, making my own choices is the best thing in life." Graham, furrowing his brow, said slyly, "Well, I am sorry. I overdid it. And then I wanted you to get your mind off those sad thoughts." "Yes, thank you, of course. Sometimes, you have to endure everything to the end. To drink the cup of suffering to the bottom. Or to have the strength to start life anew. And our divorce was that cup, at least for me." Graham, listening to her, did not utter a word. He knew he had failed to support Ella when a woman needed understanding and support. Instead, he had thrown himself into drowning his grief in his work. Of course, that was what many people would do, especially men. But Ella drowned her grief and unfulfilled dreams of a peaceful family life in a frantic workload of her affairs. She had succeeded, as far as he was concerned. Graham was still thinking about Ella. What is her personal life? No one could tell me anything concrete. Does she even have a temporarily intimate relationship? That his ex-wife did not have a steady relationship, Graham already knew. Otherwise, he would not have hoped to get their relationship back on track. "So, have you calmed down a bit?" Graham asked. "Yeah, let us move on," Ella replied. Graham sighed in relief, and almost theatrically circling his arm around her as if inviting Ella to participate in the choice, suggested she distract them from their sad thoughts. "I know where we are going. It is right around here. Can you walk in those high heels?" Graham said. "Well, if I cannot, you will carry me, of that I am sure," Ella said almost jokingly. "Come on." Graham was so relieved that they were not continuing the subject of their loss, that he immediately took Ella under his arm and led her into the darkness of the block. They walked side by side, trying to close that sad past with new impressions. He could not talk to Ella when they had lost their child, and he could not remember it now. Graham wanted to remember this, only some of the time. He hoped that after all these years, they both wanted to have new experiences and enjoy something simple. If Ella would let him, he wanted a fresh start. Chapter 5. Graham led Ella to a neighborhood that seemed to be extinct. The buildings around were built at the beginning of the last century. The dark red bricks were battered in places, and some houses' dark, solid wooden doors did not look welcoming despite the lanterns hanging over the entrance. The corner building at which they stopped resembled a café in France, with canvas-striped marquee awnings over the ground floor windows, dark frames of rounded arches of windows, and black-figured poles of Parisian-style metal street lamps lining the street. A sign on the corner of the street where they were staying said something like, "The place where H lived and worked." The famous writer of the 19th century. Another sign, almost brown with rust, bore the name of another street, which also sounded strange, the street where the master of alchemy lived. Ella looked around, and behind her, she noticed a white sign with a stylized hand in a white glove pointing a finger toward a dark alley. The sign looked unusual. It had no writing and looked like a fairy tale prop in this metropolis. Someone was having fun here, putting up signs that differed from the common ones. "What are we doing here?" Ella asked, looking around, confused. "Here we shall see how people live who are no longer in this world," replied Graham, stopping and staring into the darkness of the narrow street before which they controlled. Ella was still looking around in wonder. "I have never been to this area. How do you know anything interesting here? It does not look that way. Quite the contrary, this place gives me the creeps that it is unsafe." The young woman shivered. Graham felt a surge of energy from her fear, and retaking Ella's hand, squeezed it tightly with his large warm hand, saying, "Do not worry, you are safe with me. Let us go." The couple walked deeper into the darkness of the alley. Ella, sometimes stumbling over the uneven pavement, held Graham's hand as he walked slightly ahead her. The dim light from the street lamps above the doors of the houses sometimes gave her a glimpse of new placards that showed who had lived or worked there. Ella noticed the plaque that interested her. The plaque said, "The famous theater director S. lived and worked here." "Who are they? Do you know anything about these art people?" Ella turned again to Graham. He answered with a glance at the sign. "Yes, I know. He lived and worked here a century ago. There is an old theater nearby where we can see his posters." "What posters? Do you mean those in their museum?" Ella looked at Graham incomprehensibly. "No, do not be frightened. It is just that his plays are still running in this theater." "How do you know?" "I have never heard you say you ever go to the theater." Ella looked at Graham in surprise. "But there is still a lot you do not know about me. Perhaps there is an opportunity to get reacquainted," Graham replied, drawing Ella away from that sign. The couple went down another alleyway, where there was even less light. It was illuminated only by the occasional lantern near the doors of the houses. The steps leading up to the front doors of the alley looked almost crumbling in places. But the iron canopies over the entrances to the homes were richly decorated with iron filigree lace, a reminder of the beauty of the work of the master smiths. In the darkness, it all looked almost fabulous. The young men paced the uneven sidewalk of the alley, winding their way through a dark neighborhood of ancient buildings. Some windows covered by lace curtains showed the faint light of nightlights. There was not a soul anywhere. At other times, this would have frightened Ella. Still, after the emotional turmoil of explaining herself to Graham and the heavy memories, the young woman walked beside the man, who carefully picked her up by the elbow as if she stumbled. Suddenly, one door of the house in the distance opened. The couple slowed slightly, peering into the silhouette that emerged from the dark doorway. A tall figure stood on the steps of the entrance to the house and seemed to pay no attention to the approaching men. The man in the dark cloak looked up toward the moon, which appeared from behind the clouds and cast a bluish glow. The shadows outlined the silhouette even better. Coming very close to that house, Ella suddenly realized it was a tall woman with gray hair styled in a bun at the back. A broad cloak that seemed out of place on this hot summer night concealed the woman's arms. Graham suddenly stopped and pulled Ella back, preventing her from approaching that house. He blocked Ella in, as if protecting her from something. Ella asked him in a whisper of surprise, "What is the matter? Who is it? Why are we not moving on?" Graham replied in a whisper as well, holding her behind him. "Stay here. Stay away from her." "Why? Who is that?" Ella whispered, even more surprised. "It is not a person but a ghost, a vision." "Come on, and I was not expecting that either." "Well, let us get out of here now." Graham turned Ella around and led her away, treading carefully and constantly looking back at the silhouette of the woman, who had not noticed them and was still looking at the moon. When the young people had gone far enough away from that house and turned into another well-lit alleyway, Ella could not stand it, and stopping, turned to Graham and said, "That is it. Tell me what this is all about. I am just dying of curiosity." Retaking her hand, Graham led her calmly away from the block while telling her the history of the place. "I was not expecting us to see something like this. I just wanted to show you an unusual place where people are looking for a little romance. And some of them find it, like us." He smiled and kissed Ella gently on the cheek. She did not resist, but kept her questioning gaze on Graham. "And then what happened?" she asked, looking at him demandingly. "I have heard stories that only sometimes do people get to see the mistress of the area, the very woman you and I just saw," Graham replied. "Mistress?" Ella did not know what he was talking about. "Yes, mistress." Graham nodded and explained. "This woman owned a huge fortune almost a century and a half ago, and became a patron of the arts, supporting young unknown artists and theaters in the area. In her old age, she bequeathed half of her fortune to her heirs and to a charitable foundation that continued her work. Sometimes, her ghost appears in the neighborhood and signifies something significant happening afterward. If that ghost woman is quietly looking at the moon, those who see her are happy. It is trouble if they see that woman standing with her head bowed to her arms folded in front of her chest, as if praying. The locals believe that this spirit foretells everyone's future." Ella stared dazedly at Graham. She was not the least bit excited about where the woman was looking, but struck by the enthusiasm with which Graham told some fairy tale he seemed to believe. Ella stroked Graham's arm and said a little sarcastically, "Nothing is going to happen. We both saw that woman looking at the moon. Then we will be fine." She did not notice herself saying, "at our place," as if they were still a couple. Graham also noticed this caveat, but answered nothing. Looking into Ella's eyes, he replied confidently, "I believe we are going to be okay." He tones to emphasize that we. Ella was embarrassed, and lowered her eyes and whispered, "That is not what I meant. I just—" Graham did not let her finish. "Say nothing. I understand everything. You are not ready for anything that could be between us again. It is still possible. I can see it in your eyes and feel it when—" With these words, he leaned slightly toward the young woman and gently touched his lips to hers. She did not turn away, but did not respond to the kiss. Ella's thoughts were all about the future. Did they have one? What awaited them an hour from now, a day from now, or a month from now? Was it worth starting all over again? They already knew much about each other, but much remained a mystery. Now she knew Graham believed, or at least was interested, in something supernatural. It was an entirely unexpected side of his personality that had opened up. Ella had never imagined that, such a materialist, as she had always thought. Graham could not believe in anything but the earthly power of money. However, he had revealed his new character and personality traits to her, and Ella was astonished. She had told him before that she had had witches in her lineage. Well, at least that is what her grandmother Lily had said. So now Graham was showing her the block with the ghost that had even come out to meet them. Maybe this is all just a prank, flashed in Ella's mind. Graham just orchestrated the whole thing for her. Of course, for a rich man like him, nothing is a problem, even booking a play for the two of them. Those thoughts flashed and immediately evaporated. Everything in that picture of the dark alleyway, the silhouette of the woman looking at the moon, and Graham's reaction were genuine. They walked through the dark streets of the old quarter. Ella, tired of the fast walk and pausing at one door, begged, "Let us go back. I am tired, and I am scared already." "Why is not anyone here, just that ghost?" The young woman looked genuinely confused. Graham, who had not let go of her hand, was also forced to stop abruptly, and, turning to Ella, was suddenly right in front of her, and in order not to run into Ella, was forced to rest his hands over her against the wall of the house by which Ella had stopped. His face was very near hers, and he whispered, "Do not be afraid. I am with you." Suddenly a knock was heard from above, from the second-floor window of a house opposite. The curtain in the window flung open, and the faint light of the room lamp fell directly on the couple standing in front of the window. There was a silhouette of someone in the window. It looked like the figure was looking at them. The young woman froze, looking at that window. Ella could not tell if it was a male figure or a female. Graham, without changing his posture, looked back into the light. Then, the curtain pulled back, and the light in the window went out. Ella could not see who was there, and it scared her. So she looked at Graham fearfully. "Who was that? All the houses here seem to be empty." "I am afraid," her voice trembled. "Maybe it was a ghost too, but you are not afraid of them. You told me you were a bit of a witch, did you?" Graham answered half jokingly, half seriously, staring vacantly into Ella's eyes, which seemed like dark lakes so vast they were open. Without taking her eyes off Graham, the young woman wrapped her arms around his neck, and her lips touched his. It was a kiss, so tender, almost without touch. Graham understood she still needed him. She still felt something for him that was not extinguished by their ordeal. The man slowly kissed her, keeping his hands on the wall above her shoulders. Passion took hold of both of them, and the kiss became more heated. Ella pressed her whole body against Graham's, and a passionate moan escaped her lips. Suddenly, Graham moved abruptly away from her. "What is wrong with you? Are you? You do not want to go on?" Ella asked, heaping her hands on his shoulders. I want to. But I cannot. I cannot afford it now. Maybe it is just a passing wish, and nothing will happen next. Wake up tomorrow, and there is nothing." Graham tilted his head to Ella's face, testingly searching her dark eyes for the answer to his question. Ella, also looking straight into his eyes, whispered, "I missed you. It is probably silly, but I have had no one since you." Graham exhaled sharply in relief and grabbed her into his arms. "My baby girl. I was hoping you would say something like this. And you are still kissing me. I am just going crazy with happiness." He touched Ella's lips again and never let them go, seeking in the kiss the passion that brought them together again. Graham kissed Ella but could not tell her, "I have had no one since you." He had had that relationship. He tried to forget what they had, but he could not. Since Ella, none of the women, even the most beautiful and intelligent, attracted him spiritually and physically. An ex-wife of his had enchanted him, as if a witch had enchanted a prince. Now Graham believed that anything was possible between them, a new passion and life. He would do anything to get her back. Chapter 6. Graham thought he was on his way to victory over himself. He needed to prove to himself that he could win her back, his ex-wife. She had left him so suddenly, and then filed for divorce, that he could not even come to his senses. He thought the reason was his inability to empathize with her about losing their unborn child. Many men react the same way. Graham could not sit by Ella's side and see her suffering in a difficult emotional situation. He had to run somewhere, swing an axe, cut down trees, or fight the enemy. He did not know who his enemy was, except that fate mistreated them. Or maybe it was a punishment for both of them for being arrogant and thinking that no obstacle could affect them. They could not outrun nature. Something went wrong, and their child could not live over 3 months from conception. All the things the doctors told him, and Ella afterward. That many couples did. That nature selected the most viable embryos and discarded those who did not meet her requirements. All that did not help, but only added to the feeling of helplessness. For him, his first child could not be born. It was like a punch in the gut. He, so capable, could not conceive a child that would develop normally and be accepted. Graham's male soul protested against it. Perhaps it was not his fault but Ella's. He did not want to think so, but since Graham had never had children or attempted to have them, the thought was constantly rolling around in his mind. Graham could not voice his suspicions to Ella. She was mortified to have lost a child, their hope and joy, their future. This grief did not bring them closer together. It drove them apart. The grief was also a blow to Ella. She did not understand why Graham did not sympathize with her but went off on his missions, came home all squeezed out, and did not talk to her about their loss and her feelings. Ella confused a relationship with a man with a relationship with her friends. She had no experience of relationships with men, and she thought Graham should listen to her complaints and sympathy like her friends and relatives. He could not do that. Graham suffered, but his anguish lingered in the deepening work and the dangerous tasks he was eager to perform for his country's secret service, sparing neither time nor health. Ella decided that their relationship was over. She expected to support in such a situation, not walk away from the problem with her head on the sand like an ostrich. That was how she thought Graham would behave. Ella needed to talk to her then spouse, but he could not stand it, and started hiding from her at his job. Graham was dumbfounded when Ella filed for divorce, but moved out of his apartment first. He could not offer her anything else at that moment. After the divorce, which he gave her without hindrance, Graham realized Ella only wanted his moral support, not money. The young woman refused to accept anything from him in the divorce. She would not give Graham back his gifts, a diamond pendant on a chain and a ring. She took nothing else for herself. Graham felt abandoned. He had been left for lack of use. Because of an inability to empathize in the same way that women require. What did she want him to do? Cry? No, that will not happen. Graham could not comfort Ella with the expectation of future children. He had only told her that once. She had flipped out. What was he allowing himself? Their baby would have to be born now, and Graham suggested she wait for something in the future. Ella wanted to hold their baby now. She was not ready to wait months, if not years, to find out if they would still have the baby. Ella could not imagine that Graham would wait. She thought it was her fault, that she could not carry the baby. It was her body that had rejected their child's little body. Ella felt enormous guilt for her child and Graham, but she could not say that to Graham. The easiest thing for her to do was to go deep into her grief and lay blame on him, demanding of him as a man the almost impossible, a show of sympathy, constant, every time she needed it. Suppose Graham had understood how she felt then. They could still have a family, and he could have come to his mansion and seen Ella and their children playing by the Christmas tree. Graham was sure they needed children, that was right, in the plural. He had no financial reason to limit the family size if his wife could have over one child. The first attempt to create what Graham thought was a full-fledged family failed. He could not support Ella in the right way, and she left him. It was not his money or his charm that held her back. Charm did not work when Graham saw his wife avoid talking to him. He had hoped, until the last day of their divorce, that Ella would come to her senses and try to repair her relationship with him. Still, the years passed, and she went deep into her business like him. Ella had made a fortune, but had yet to create a new family. That alone gave Graham hope he could try to win back his love and right their previous wrongs. Now Graham acted, realizing that Ella's feelings for him were still lingering. He was older than she was. He took responsibility for everything that would happen to them from now on. Though Ella tried to be independent, she still needed his strong hand and loving heart. So Graham decided he would bring her back, no matter what. Chapter 7. Ella reminisced, sitting on the cozy couch in her luxurious apartment. Did I need Graham again? She thought. His kiss brought back that long-forgotten feeling of needing the care and warmth of someone close to her. In recent years, Ella tried not to remember that she was a woman and that feelings required physical love. With her head buried in her work, the young woman tried to numb the pain of the past loss of her child and the inability to decide on a new relationship. Now Ella realized she had never wanted a new relationship. But could she now admit to herself that she still needed Graham? Yes, Ella needed his kisses, his embrace. She required her Graham. However, how do I show him the road to her was open? We parted after that adventure in the haunted quarter, as if no one was going to go on, the young woman thought. When Graham tried to kiss her again at the door to her house, Ella slipped to her home firmly away from him, holding out her hand as if to shield herself from temptation. Graham did not insist. Apparently, he felt it was not worth taking the first step toward each other. Returning to reality, Ella looked out the window at the gorgeous view below. The park and the tall houses made it feel like she was watching life, just as she was now looking down on the park from above. Life was passing her by. She still had no family and no one to love except her parents and dogs. Of course, it would be pretty challenging for her without dogs. Who could refuse the unconditional love of those fluffy babies? There are some conditions, though. They need to be fed, they need to be walked with, and they need to be stroked. Let them sleep in your bed. What kind of man would put up with that? Ella stroked one spy, while the other waited patiently for his turn to be given the same mercy as his mistress. It is all beautiful, her pets, money, and settled life. There is only one thing missing, love. The passionate love she knew when she fell in love with Graham. A funny and sad thought occurred to Ella. What if she had replaced the care and love of dogs with human care and love? No, it just did not work that way. She did not like any of the men who constantly gave her attention. A woman with money, and with a lot of money, and a woman who earned it, attracted many men. Some were simply ladies' men trying to get to her purse. Look, a lonely, young, attractive, and wealthy woman walks here. Why not go to her and try your luck? What if everything works out? She will take the bait, and they will get a complete package of luck. All-inclusive money, a young life partner, and the opportunity to boast in front of others of their victory. Other men, not much in need of money, tried to have a relationship with Ella, or rather an affair, just their sporting curiosity. They pondered something like this. Here was this woman. Yes, she has done a lot but does not have a man by her side. There is something wrong with her. We need to find out what is wrong. Maybe she just has not met a real man, and it will be he. That is more than many imagined, as sporting interest does not get you far. Put a woman to bed, let everyone know it is done, and you can break up. Here, everything is safe. There will not be any accusations like, I gave you everything, and you. This happens when one seduces an inexperienced young woman or one who does not know that any decent man is even interested in her. Those men who thought this way never offered far-reaching plans. Their motto was, take me and what I am offering you now or goodbye. Their self-esteem was very high, so their sporting interest in getting Ella was off the charts. Ella had learned to walk through life confidently and was not caught up in offers of an easy relationship. After all, she already knew what true and passionate love was. It taught her that there are real feelings and relationships and their substitutes, appearances. Ella did not think it was worth settling for substitutes for the real thing in her life. If true love had disappeared from her life, or as Ella now realized, had lurked in the depths of her soul, it was no good replacing the real with a fake. Ella did not trade on affairs with men who could not infatuate her as much as Graham did. A temporary fling would not be worth a fraction of the pleasure Graham could give her. Everything about these men differed from the beginning. They would treat her like a prize in an open contest to see who would get her. Then, teach her how to turn them down for so long. With such men, Ella only flirted, not allowing them to get too close to her, to at least create the appearance of a relationship with herself. After most of such relationship seekers stopped trying to get her, some of them, because of a wounded ego, attempted to spread rumors that Ella was not interested in men at all. Most of the people around Ella remembered how happy she was with Graham. They did not respond to these innuendos. Instead, people thought, well, you have not made it, calm down and leave that woman alone. You are just not up to Graham's level. That was how it turned out, whether about male attractiveness, wealth, or the aspirant's standard or quirky personality to Ella's attention. There was a third type of man, men as wealthy as Graham. However, many of them already had a family. If they did not have a family, plenty of women wanted them at their disposal. Ella was not one of them. So such men, if they saw her, did not see her as a potential life partner. Why? There was a choice among much more beautiful and accessible women. So, among billionaires or simply wealthy men, Ella was not a hit with them. Yes, there were so few in society that it took a lot of work to say who had regular access to them. All the same, Graham, who had become a billionaire very young and who was still single when he met Ella, was one of the few. Ella was lucky to meet her love and experience all the best and most painful things with him. So what would she do now? Did she need a quiet but empty life, waiting for who knows what happened? Graham winced, as Ella wanted to see him again. The phone rang. Ella shuddered, as if awakened from a dream, picked up the phone without looking and answered it. Graham's deep baritone sounded on the receiver. Chapter 8. Graham spoke to Ella as if the years of separation had not happened between them. However, it was hard for him. He wanted to get back together with Ella so severely that he feared scaring her off with something too bold. His head was full of plans. In them, he and Ella were already old men with grandchildren. No, they were not. Graham did not think that far ahead. Who among young men thinks that far ahead? He was no exception. He needed Ella, her love, her adoration, which he would feel again, kissing her there in the haunted alleyway nights. Now, speaking to Ella in a cheerful voice, Graham tried to keep a relatively neutral tone, as if he were uninterested in her favorable decision about his proposal. The proposal was to spend the coming weekend together. If Ella only knew how long he had thought about what and how to offer her. It seemed to Graham that he had not been gentle enough with her, that she might not yet forgive him for his inability to get over their shared loss, their unborn child. However, they still have a life. They are both still so young, so we must create it all over again. He will do his best. What does Ella think? He will find out when he spends a little more time with her. Ella, listening to Graham, smiled with an influx of joyful emotion. Finally, he had taken the first step. He is calling her. It meant that her feelings for him mattered. Ella held the phone receiver against her cheek, tears streaming down her cheeks joyfully. Graham heard Ella sobbing and became confused. What is wrong with you? Are you not feeling well? No, I am fine. Ella replied, wiping away her tears with the sleeve of her robe. It is all right. So, are you suggesting we visit that place you have visited recently? What is that place? You will have fun there. You can trust me. Graham said soothingly. Will you be ready to go out by 11 o'clock? Tonight, of course. Ella replied, laughing a chesty laugh. Yes, I will be ready. Will you pick me up? Call me when you are downstairs. I will come out. They both knew it was useless to think about Graham entering Ella's apartment. She was not ready for that yet. Graham did not think so, so he did not even ask. He had, as a matter of course, he said to come to her place. Ella had not even asked how he knew her address, because she had not given it to him. She knew Graham had every source of information about her available to him. That he stayed out of her life and gave her time to sort out her feelings and goals made her warmly grateful for his understanding. That was all Graham was, so non-masculine sensitive. The only thing he could not bear was his loss. Graham's understanding and Ella's longing for him seemed to fall into place. Chapter 9. Ella packed up the dogs on the road too. She would not leave them behind. The faithful dogs followed her wherever she went, if she went out of town on business. Ella said nothing to Graham about the dogs. She was now an independent woman, and could decide for herself what she did with her dogs. Since Graham had said nothing about them being allowed or not, Ella took them with her, as a matter of course. It is up to him to adjust to how she lives, if he wants to communicate with her. It would not be like before. She has genuine autonomy, and will not give it up to anyone. At first, out of a habit of obeying her elders and authority figures, she wanted to call Graham back and ask about the dogs, but decided not to do so. So instead, just walked out the house's front door and confronted him with the fact that there were dogs. Deep down, Ella wanted to see how Graham felt about pets. When they had lived together briefly, they had had no pets. Before Ella, Graham had lived the lifestyle of a businessman without a family, and had no desire to take care of anyone else. At least, that is what Ella thought. Yet they never discussed whether she wanted to get a cat, dog, or other animals or birds at home. Perhaps Graham's mansion was so uninhabitable that it never occurred to Ella to ask Graham if she could get a dog, even after losing the baby. Doctors gently advised her to turn her need to care for someone to pets to ease the pain of loss. Unfortunately, Ella could not ignore her feelings and replace the child with a pet. Graham then distanced himself from her, not knowing how to help her. Ella did not understand why he was doing this. She felt guilty about what had happened in their family. Graham should have gone to a therapist with her then. He may have understood how to behave in that situation. Then it was too late, Ella had left him. Now, Ella did not want to dive into any more memories and concentrated on what awaited her today. What surprise did Graham have in store for her? As Ella got ready to go, Graham drove through the car-filled streets of the metropolis. People were rushing to work, moving between jobs during the day, or running out of offices for lunch at nearby cafes. The city was already buzzing with its everyday life. Graham drove up to the house where Ella lived. He knew her address. Graham had known it for a long time, only he did not think it was possible to guard Ella outside her house. So sometimes, he would drive up to her home late at night and stare for a few minutes at her windows, glowing in the city's darkness with a warm, yellowish, cozy light. Graham longed to see Ella's silhouette in the window. Still, her floor was so high up and surrounded by a terrace that no shapes could be seen from the street. Now Graham stopped confidently in front of the entrance of Ella's house and beckoned the door attendant to approach the car. He approached, and Graham rolled down the window of the door of his old, inconspicuous car and asked, "Do you know if Mrs. Anderson came out downstairs?" He shook his head in response. "Mrs. Anderson?" The door attendant interjected in surprise but came to his senses and replied, "Sorry, I did not see her come downstairs. Will you wait for her, or do you want to message her?" Graham suddenly smiled broadly and replied, "No, I am just waiting for her. She will be down soon. Please, tell her Mr. Anderson is waiting for her." The door attendant stared at Graham in surprise. So that is what he is, her ex-husband. They said he was a billionaire, but you cannot tell. Mrs. Anderson, though unpretentious in her choice of clothes, still has a couple of expensive things in her use. This man, apart from his confident behavior, nothing else could suggest that he possesses not only power but also money. With these thoughts, the door attendant hurried back to his desk, expecting to get a good tip from Mrs. Anderson for this message. Instead, this billionaire, or was he, offered him nothing as a reward. He was the biggest cheapskate the world has ever seen. Or was he pretending to be her ex-husband? The woman was wealthy. She had got it all to herself. Everyone knew who had talked to her on personal or business matters. The door attendant knew everything about all the tenants, their families, and their guests. That was his profession. The door attendant remained standing at his counter, quite reeling from the information he had now received about Mrs. Anderson. Perhaps one thing he did not know about her was what her ex-husband looked like. He had long since disappeared from all publications and internet resources. What was he doing? Why is he revisiting his ex-wife? Could it be? No, it was impossible. She was not interested in men at all. At least the door attendant caught no one coming to her apartment. No men. She was a nun, or a lesbian. So he decided long ago, having lost hope of getting news about her private life. Finally, the elevator doors opened, and Ella stepped out into the lobby. The two dogs were happily scampering along beside her. Ella held their leashes and a bag full of clothes in one hand. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Anderson," the door attendant said in a peculiar, meaningful way. "Good afternoon," Ella replied, gazing into the door attendant's face. Why was he looking at her, as if she had done something wrong? "Mr. Anderson is expecting you," the door attendant chanted kindly, and was pleased to observe the apparent embarrassment on this proud woman's face. She felt shame that her last name was not hers but her husband's. She picked up that point in the door attendant's tone and tried to get rid of his testing gaze by giving him a couple of small denominations to reward his zeal. Ella stepped out of the house's lobby, right under the awning that covered the path from the front door of her home to the driveway. She looked around and saw nothing resembling a billionaire's car. Graham got up from his wrecked vehicle and waved hello to her. He was waiting for her a little head down the street, since that was the only place he could find to park his car. Ella noticed his smile and shining blue eyes, and her legs became cotton candy. She could not take a step towards him. Finally, he realized Ella was perplexed and walked toward her. Then Graham noticed her dogs. He immediately squatted down and extended his arms toward them. The dogs rushed toward him, sniffing at his new acquaintance. He scratched their ears and rubbed their withers, which made the dogs extremely happy. Ella did not seem to notice her pets. Instead, she was looking at Graham. As Graham greeted her pets, the young woman stood and melted. Ella thought his big, strong hands were not stroking the dogs but hers, on her head, shoulders, and back. She felt as if she, not her dogs, were being caressed by his touch. Ella saw only Graham now, and felt only his warmth and tenderness. Him, how she had missed it all these years. The dogs decided that this type was no danger to their mistress. He knew how to rub their thick fur so well, indeed, he was a worthwhile type. Finally, the dogs realized their mistress was not paying attention to them. So, they began jealously circling at Ella's feet, climbing up on their hind legs and resting their forelegs. Outside, they were used to being the center of her attention, but here, Ella finally noticed that her attention was being demanded by these little ones, and bent down to them. Graham admired her grace. He, too, watched the young woman pet the dogs, and thought it would be good for him to get at least a share of that petting. Someday, Graham would regain her favor and enjoy her touch. But for now, he had to get Ella away from her and get her attention, which he would do in the coming hours. Graham carefully sat Ella down in his car and noticed that she glanced around in surprise but did not say a word, asking why he was driving such an old car. They put the dogs in the back seat, cleverly covered with an old blanket, and strapped them in with unique harness straps. Ella had everything with her for the dogs: a blanket, car harnesses, a supply of food and water, bowls, and combs. Graham watched Ella with some surprise as she fiddled with the dogs as if they were her children. He noticed she had so much unspent tenderness and needed to care for someone that it was all poured out on her pets instead of her children. Graham also thought he would have been happy to have children with her. Ella could be a caring mother, which he never doubted. He would watch Ella put their children in the car like that. Graham forced himself to stop daydreaming and get down to business. Once everyone was in the car, he eased out of the way, and the merry company drove away from town. Ella did not ask where they were going. She had given the day to Graham. Ella knew she should trust him. He wanted so much to surprise her, and she did not want to ruin the moment by letting him know she had already figured out what was in store for them. The car left the city, drove through the suburbs, then down the freeway. Ella could not figure out where they were going, but hesitated to ask Graham. After about 45 minutes of driving, they pulled up to a long building decorated in some eclectic style of farmhouse and castle. On the sign at the entrance to the courtyard, Ella read something like Hotel and Spring Park. Graham pulled up in front of a motel-type structure and parked the car. "Wait for me. I will be quick," he said to Ella, vigorously got up from the car and walked towards the front of the building. It was a motel. But what does this have to do with the park and the springs? Ella thought. By the time Graham returned, Ella was already going through her phone, looking for a description of the place. Yes, it was a motel where you could stay overnight and walk in the surroundings. However, it belonged to a nature reserve, a national park with natural mineral water springs. The water was not potable, but you could bathe in the springs if you wanted to. Ella looked up at Graham with a slightly guilty expression, revealing that she already knew something about the place. She was delighted. He had chosen a place where it was possible to rest and walk with her dogs. The motel accepted guests with pets. So Graham had thought of something she would enjoy. He is so good. Ella got out of the car, and ignoring the dogs scraping furiously at the back seat door, stood in front of Graham and looking slyly at him, said, "Well, please, Axe, do you like this place? Do you like this place?" Graham repeated after her, looking at her with a smile. Ella replied, "Yes, I do. Very much." She rose on her tiptoes and kissed Graham gently on the cheek. He did not expect it. Then Graham took Ella by the shoulders and squeezed them lightly with his arms, hesitating to show more appreciation for her expression of approval. Then he turned her back to him and nudged her slightly away from the car in the motel's direction. "And now, Mistress Know-It-All, please follow me." At the motel desk, they were given a room and tickets to go to the park to the Springs. Ella was a little surprised that Graham had gotten them into a shared space, but he explained it was only so they could rest after their walk. It did not mean they had to spend the night here. The place was only an hour from Ella's house. So of course she would get home tonight. Elle calmed down only after the walk and left right away. At first, she suspected that Graham took the shared space to get closer to her intimately. Still, Ella was unprepared for anything like that and dismissed such thoughts. Nothing would happen. They were adults, and each had their own lives long ago. She knew how to dispose of who approached her and how. Nothing more would happen if she were not ready for something more than just a cuddle with Graham. Though somewhere inside, her feeling flickered that this was not all for nothing, a hotel with a shared room, if only for half a day, as Graham had said. Graham had booked them a room with no second thoughts. He saw Ella was not ready for more than a kiss. That was already a huge accomplishment after he had lost her for years. Right now, he would not risk pushing her away with hasty action. The beds in the room would remain empty and cold. There was nothing else he had planned. Honestly. After feeding the dogs and giving them a drink, the couple stowed their things, left them in the room, and went into the motel lobby for lunch. Graham told Ella they should be well fed before going to the Springs. He also added that he did not like hunting wild animals, so they would rather eat at the motel. Ella laughed, and they had a good time at lunch. Ella watched Graham as if she had just gotten to know him. Maybe she was getting to know him now. Before he had seemed like some celestial, so far his life was from hers. After they had been through the ordeal of his ambition and her pride, the pair needed to get to know each other all over again. Which they did, chatting merrily over lunch. Graham also watched Ella surreptitiously how she had changed since they had parted. There was confidence in her. This confidence had always been with her, but now it was evident in her every gesture and word. Ella did not give the impression of a woman who was trying by all means to show her importance. On the contrary, she was confident enough not to show her independence and to notice others and their desires. Graham suddenly thought, "There she is, my perfect woman." He was embarrassed himself. He longed for Ella, but could not understand why. He had seen and felt many women in his years apart from her, but none of them compared to Ella. No one could blame him for having a relationship with them, not those women, nor those around him. After the dissolution of his marriage, he was an independent, very wealthy, and attractive young man looking for an opportunity to create a new family. That was the perception of society and his circle. Graham was surprised that he had not heard the same rumors about Ella. When the door attendant at her house pronounced her surname, Graham was pleasantly astonished to listen to his surname for Ella from a stranger's lips. However, he knew well that Ella did not change his last name back to her maiden name after the divorce. When they had finished lunch, Graham walked with Ella back to the room to get the dogs and change their clothes to something more suitable for a walk in nature. Of course, upon entering the room, they were both a little embarrassed. Still, they did their usual business as if they were just friends. Ella was the first to unpack her bag to pull out her things: jeans, a long-sleeved forest shirt, and lace-up boots. She took the things out and looked questioningly at Graham, who seemed deep in thought, sitting in an armchair by the window. Ella realized he did not intend to leave the room. She went into the shower room to change. Do all women somewhere deep down inside want to be taken by force? Well, not by force, but by perseverance. So Ella thought, staring at Graham standing at the window. Against the light, he was good-looking. Broad shoulders, thick hair, narrow hips, and long muscular legs. He is like a Greek god, Ella's mind flashed. She could not get him out of her head. He was too good-looking for a man, but he was the most masculine man she knew. Well, shall we go? Graham approached but did not touch her. He gestured for her to leave the room. Ella realized she could not imagine any more than that, and taking the dogs by their leashes, they left the motel room. Graham locked the room door, and they went off to find a trail leading to the springs. Chapter 10. The couple walked down the path away from the motel. The trail meandered through the scenic hills. Fields were planted with different crops, wheat, peas, and something else like oats. Ella did not know everything that grew here. However, the beauty was indescribable. Graham walked a little ahead, and Ella followed him, leading her dogs. The weather was not hot, light clouds obscured the blue sky. Ella asked Graham, "What was promised for today?" "I thought it would rain, but I did not see when. Maybe it was about our town, and here we have gone far enough away. Maybe it will get around." Graham turned to her. "Yeah, we did not take care of the umbrellas. But you know, they do not look right," he laughed. "We will manage even if it rains. There are pavilions by the springs." They continued walking, and soon entered the shade of sprawling oaks. The rounded crowns of the old trees overhang the path like tents. Ella thought that no rain would hurt them under such canopies, even if it did. The path led them to an ancient fountain, carefully sheltered by a canopy as a dome, which rested on round pillars. The gazebo resembled a tent. Ella was the first to enter under its roof and read the description of the mineral water of this spring. The water smelled distinctly, and the dogs did not like it. So they tried to hide behind Ella and not go close to the water reservoir, where the fountain's stream in the middle of the pavilion fell. Graham took a unique mug out of his backpack and handed it to Ella. "Please take it. It is for you. I bought it for you," he said with a smile, handing Ella a blue mug whose handle was shaped like a tube. Now, the young woman could drink water. Ella looked at Graham with surprise but gratitude, and gently took the mug from his hand. Their fingers touched, and Ella felt a rush of tenderness toward Graham. He takes care of me. I only imagined that Graham wanted to get me into bed again. However, he was just caring. Oh, I want to feel his gentle yet passionate touch again. Such thoughts flew into Ella's mind. The young woman was embarrassed by such thoughts in a completely wrong place, and drew water from the fountain. She tried to drink it, but the taste could have been better than she had imagined from the mineral water sold in bottles in the shops. Yes, there is her natural scent here. But its minerals are all natural, it is guaranteed here. Graham reassured her, noticing her indecision. Drink in peace. Nature filters everything, so this water is perfectly safe for our bodies, even without boiling. Ella drank the whole mug of mineral water little by little, and looking questioningly at Graham, she said, "Where is your mug?" He smiled. "I can drink water without a mug." He leaned over to the fountain and drank directly from it, laughingly catching the trickle of water with his lips. The splash of water glistened on his face, and his shirt at the top was drenched. He was pleased that he could show Ella that he was not the refined billionaire who eats only from gold plates, as everyone probably thinks. Ella wanted to walk up to him, touch his face, and wipe the water drops off his lips. Let us kiss him. Yeah, she could think of it now. Suddenly, there was a peal of thunder above them. Ella looked around, surprised and a little afraid, and saw the sky covered in blue clouds. The white edges of one of them were coming right at them. Graham also looked up at the sky in surprise. Nothing was promised here. But we have to go back, and the sooner the better, he said firmly. Maybe we can make it to the motel before the storm hits. They each grabbed a dog and hurried away from the spring. The surrounding fields seemed to buzz. It looked like the sea raged around them as the wind churned the waves across them. The wind had become so strong that it was almost ripping the dogs, whose thick fur was now working like a sail. Ella cradled her pet and tried to cover him from the wind gusts. It had not started raining yet, but halfway back, they realized the weather had deteriorated so much that they would have to seek shelter immediately. Graham stopped, holding Ella next to him with one hand, his dog in the other. Ella looked at him without fear but still anxiously. What is it? Graham almost shouted, trying to block out the noise of the gusts of wind. We need to stop and find a place to shelter from the storm. Ella confusedly looked around. But where? What is there around here where we can hide? Graham tried to stare into the falling darkness, and the rain drizzled heavily, turning the air around them gray. Everything around them seemed gray. Everything around them grew darker, with the clouds coming in like evening. Suddenly, Graham noticed something in the distance and headed in that direction, pulling Ella. They came to a narrow path leading to the hills that began at the edge of the field. The young men followed the trail, stumbling constantly and trying not to let go of the dogs, who sometimes barked but were still whimpering with anxiety. The backpacks behind their backs seemed excessively heavy, though there was nothing extra in them. Unfortunately, there were no umbrellas either. However, with the increasing wind, the umbrellas would prove useless anyway. Graham pulled his cap down tightly, and they both pulled up the hoods of their jackets and tightened their straps so that there was less water on his face. None of this helped much, however. The wind was blowing so violently that the jets of rain, still tolerably light, flew almost parallel to the ground and penetrated every crevice in their clothing. The dogs already seemed drenched, though they were still protected by their exceptionally thick fur. Finally, Ella turned to Graham and shouted, "We have got to get under some shelter soon. We cannot let the dogs get soaked through." Graham stared at her in surprise. What? What about us? You care for them like they could die from a few drops of water. Ella looked gravely at Graham and shouted back just the same. Yeah, if they get soaked through, they must be dried immediately, and we cannot do that here. Graham shook his head and replied with some sarcasm. I will try to do something, but I am sorry, I am thinking of you first. I did not know you put your dogs ahead of your needs and safety. There was no sneer in Graham's voice. Instead, he looked at Ella and saw how important it was for her to save her pets. Perhaps it was the aftermath of that trauma, when she could not keep their child. Graham looked earnestly at Ella and shouted, Okay, let us keep going. I remember there was some cave over there. They came to a hillside. Some rocks protruded forward like a visor, and they could at least shelter there from the rain. The young men were about to run, driven by the wind and rain, and suddenly found themselves under this natural shelter. But as soon as they entered under the rock, just in front, some opening appeared. Graham was the first to walk up the hole and peek into it. Then he went in there and out of sight. Ella stood outside, hesitant to enter the total darkness. Then Graham's head appeared from the opening, and he shouted to her. Come here. You can stay here until the storm passes. Ella, slipping on the wet stones, cautiously approached the opening. Graham extended his hand to Ella and led her into what appeared to be a small cave. The remnants of natural light showed behind them that there was an entrance or exit, but it was impossible to see what was deep inside the cave. The young men struggled in the lightning glow to find a place to sit down and accommodate the dogs. At last, Graham chose some corner and spread his cloak there, inviting Ella to sit down and put their things there. They took out water flasks, gave the dogs a drink, and then drank themselves. Ella watched anxiously as the dogs tried to shake themselves off. Meanwhile, Graham attempted to build a fire, placing it close to the cave's exit so the smoke would escape. He did so. Ella sat on his cloak, stroking the dogs, and watched in amazement as Graham tackled the fire. It amazed her he knew how to do it at all. She thought he was a refined urban hero with millions, and he knew how to do so much more than Ella had even suspected. She watched Graham fondly, and realizing they had a fire and warmth, gently brushed the dogs close to the fire to dry their fur. Graham asked her,
"So what is the matter?
"Why are you so concerned about drying them out? They are animals. They will dry themselves." Ella answered, glancing sideways at Graham. "Pomeranians have such a thick coat and such a small body that if they were left to dry themselves, you could get pneumonia, and the dog would die. That is why I had to dry them out." She continued brushing the coats of the dogs, who had warmed up and were only squinting slightly at the fire, squinting their little button eyes. Graham sat a little aside and watched Ella. How gently she touched the dog's fur. If only she could feel him like that. Graham stood up abruptly and paced around the cave, occasionally glancing at Ella. She noticed something bothering him. "What is the matter?" He stopped and answered, "That is okay, but our phones do not work from here. That means no one will find us until we arrive at the motel. There is no one to look for us. In a storm like this, everyone's definitely in their homes." Ella shook her head and did not even take out her phone. She trusted Graham that he would already check everything. So why fuss and question his words? They spent quite a long time like that. Then, finally, Ella got tired and looked around to see where she could lie down. Graham noticed her gaze and asked, "Do you want to rest? Let me hold the dogs, and you can lie on the cloak. It is still more comfortable that way." He spread her cloak on the cave's ground and sat beside her. Ella looked at him. "What about you? Do not you want to lie down?" He looked at her in surprise. "I might not sleep. What if the wild beasts come?" There was both humor and something serious in his voice. Ella, already lying on the makeshift bed, pulled his hand to hers. "Lie down next to me. Do not be afraid." Graham gave a stifled sniffle, looked up at Ella, and saw the sparks of laughter in her eyes. "I am not afraid," he muttered, suddenly in embarrassment. "I am already lying down, just as you commanded, my mistress." Ella suddenly felt that there was a new bond and understanding between them. A bond grew stronger with every minute they spent in this forced isolation. They had no one to pay attention to or bother them. The only other people here were them. They were alone. Ella lay on her side, bending her arm and putting it under her head with the roll of her jacket. The roll was quite long. Ella turned to Graham, gesturing for him to lie beside her and use the pillow. Instead, the man sprang to the ground and carefully placed himself behind Ella. He had to put his other arm around Ella and press his whole body against her to lay his head on the roll of Ella's jacket. Ella did not resist. She could feel the heat spreading through her body. First, warmth came from his hand on her shoulder. Next, the heat came from his chest against Ella's back. Then that warmth turned to heat. Ella felt like her cheeks and whole body were on fire just as their campfire burned. It was as if it was melting her body, unraveling all the nooks and crannies hidden by the coldness of separation. Finally, Ella smiled to herself, closed her eyes, and drifted off to sleep. Chapter 11. A bright light penetrated the darkness of the cave. The young men were lying face to face and tightly embraced on the ground in the cave. The two spies were asleep, curled up against the woman's back. A beam of sunlight touched Ella's eyes. She slowly opened her eyes and saw Graham's face, still sound asleep, very close before her. "How handsome he is," thought the young woman, looking at his proud profile with its eagle nose, manly chin, and day-old stubble. "Must suffer, poor fellow, to see him out of shape, unshaven." Graham raised himself on an elbow, looking at Ella in surprise. "You what? What is wrong with you?" Ella, stretching her legs and shaking off bits of earth from her hair, stepped away from him a few feet and looked at Graham with embarrassment. "Well, what about you? Is everything okay?" Graham continued to ask in a husky voice, not understanding why Ella was acting this way. They were sleeping so well together. Ella had fully recovered from embarrassment by not answering Graham's questions, turning the conversation to a more pressing topic. "Good morning.
We need to get out of here.
They may already look for us." Graham looked around the cave and said, "Well, I would live here a few more days with you." Ella laughed embarrassedly and replied, "Yeah, sure. And all my life." She hesitated, realizing from Graham's brightened face she had said too much unnecessary now. They were not ready for a future together. Together again? Was it possible? What was she even doing here, spending the night cuddled up with her ex-husband? There is more to come. Right now, she is not ready to discuss it. She needs to get her life back to normal, back to people. Graham got up and started stretching the muscles cramping up overnight, waving his arms and wiggling his legs amusedly. Ella was already gathering their things and handing him a bottle of water. "You can wash your face. Then I will pour water on your hands," she suggested. Graham took her care not for granted but with gratitude. Since his divorce from Ella, he could not remember when anyone cared for him so much except his mother. After all, every man looks for a woman with whom attractiveness and caring would be combined. Graham had no shortage of beautiful women. But for one of them to care for him, he had no recollection of that.
Only Ella.
After finishing their morning toilet, they took turns going into the bushes to freshen up. Neither of them thought there was anything shameful about it. They had lived together before and did not need to hide mundane and natural things like the body's biological needs from each other. It was all normal. Everyone went to the toilet, brushed their teeth, and changed their underwear. It was all part of the experience of living with a human being together. Graham thought that no one was more comfortable than he was with Ella. What a fool he had been to let her go. Now Graham would not repeat his mistakes. Graham, in his turn, felt he should pay more attention to her feelings and moods so that when necessary, he could help her and not leave her to wallow in her grief. When Graham and Ella had finished their toilet routine, they exited the cave and looked at each other at the entrance simultaneously. A thought flashed through them. Could they have imagined such a thing a day ago? Life had given them a surprise. What else lay ahead of them? Again, the young men led one dog on a lead and walked across the field toward the car road. As they approached the motel, a surprised porter met them. "How, you were not in the room? Why didn't you call? From the looks of you, you were caught in a thunderstorm. So where were you?" They explained to the door attendant what had happened. As you can see, no one was looking for them. Everyone was used to having a mobile phone working. There, these young men did not even call for help. Who knows, they had a good night outside the motel. That was how happy this guy was. Finally, Ella and Graham got to their room. Ella went into the shower first and spent half an hour washing the sweat and dirt off her body. Graham waited patiently for her, watching the news on television. He did not want to be alone with his imagination, imagining a naked Ella standing there under the jets of warm water. But no, he had something urgent to do, and the news would help with that. When Ella got out of the shower, she found Graham sitting in his dirty clothes on the bed, watching the news. For leaving her alone, she felt a rush of love for him. Ella remembered he had always been happy to shower with her before. She longed to stroke his hair like a good boy. Or was there more than just tenderness in that desire? Graham stood up and, taking his clean clothes, walked past her, touching her bare shoulder lightly as he did so. Ella shook her head. She was not ready for this. But something had to be done, and she spread the bedspread where Graham sat. Suddenly, the young woman felt a light touch on her waist. She turned around. Graham was standing before her, a towel wrapped around his hips. It was as if he wanted to ask her something without approaching her, but Ella turned to him, looked into his blue eyes, stepped toward him, and embraced him. They seemed to dance the tango, a tango of passion between two people who loved each other. The dogs lay by the bed, looking at this man hugging their mistress, and both lying on the bed. Why was this man hugging Ella all the time? Why was their mistress sighing so much? Was everything all right? Then the spies calmed down and, laying their heads on their front paws, just listened to the voices of love. Now they have to get used to it. This man did nothing wrong if their mistress was pleased. Let him stay by her side. They allow it. Chapter 12. The couple got out of the motel a couple of days later. Both were consumed by what had happened between them. Graham hoped this was not a one-time adventure with his ex-wife, and Ella wanted to avoid thinking about anything further. She was happy here and now. After all, they had gone home. But where to go? They have no home in common. Graham did not think about it long enough and suggested that Ella go to his place. She could see how I live. She could stay in the comfort of my luxury accommodation. Ella deserves the rest time now. Ella was interested in Graham's offer, not so much out of boredom for comfort, but of an interest in how his life was now arranged. Graham had lived without her for several years, and now he thought, what is it that draws me to her? And her to me? Can we be together again? We should try living together again. However, Ella was not prepared to sacrifice her independence and did not even offer to discuss the fact that she had her place. She had not provided to let Graham go to her home. For her, her apartment was her haven to which Ella could return without too much trouble. The couple was at the motel behind it. The car Graham was driving was hurrying back to the metropolis. With the freeway racing toward her, she doubted what she was doing. They had not even lived together for a couple of days before Graham asked her to move back together. It was so hard to say no to him. He was so gentle with her, so caring. Ella looked around, trying not to answer Graham's questions inappropriately, but he noticed. You are not happy that we are going to my place? Do you want me to take you to your place and end it there? He said suddenly, casting a testing look at Ella between driving the car down the track. Ella shuddered. Again, that unmanly side of his working. He immediately sensed that she had something special in mind. No, you do not. We are going to your place as decided, she replied, smiling at him. Graham seemed to smile contentedly and calm down. He was frantically going over what he had in his apartment that she would not like. Everything seemed to be peaceful. He remembered that a young woman he knew had recently followed him everywhere he went. Ella was so infatuated with him that he was flattered by her attention, and they ended up in bed. He had promised her nothing, and now only regretted spending the night with her at his home. Graham thought he should have rented a hotel or gone to her place. With Ella, he had to strike the iron while it was hot. Otherwise, everything would have been between them these couple of days under the weight of returning to their old life in the city. It could not be helped. Ella would come to his house and see what he had left untidy. He hoped this temporary woman had taken all her things out of the bathroom. Meanwhile, they entered the city's center, and the car made its way through the hustle and bustle of the town at the crowded intersections. Graham drove his car carefully, knowing no one would give him a place on the road. His car cost about $1,000, and all around were gleaming with new paint cars from famous manufacturers' latest brands. Some cars cost as much as others could afford a house. The appearance of Graham's car did not give the right idea of his weight in society. He did not want it to. Graham was fed up with this tinsel while climbing to the top of society, and knew zero price. Zero. All that outward stuff was nothing. He valued only the inner substance of the person, and how much he earned or how much he cost, according to his bank account, little interested him now. Graham had seen so many people in his life who, in their foolish pursuit of wealth, overstepped all norms of communal life with other people that money concerned him less and less. Fortunately, he had stopped and looked around early enough to realize that money alone did not bring happiness or satisfaction. The car was on its way along an embankment lined with new houses interspersed with ancient buildings, perhaps from the beginning of last year's check. The neighborhood looked as if someone had renovated something, but not everything. Ella looked around in surprise. She had not known Graham had moved here. She knew he had sold his old mansion after their divorce, but she did not know where he had lived all this time. The couple exited the car at the swanky entrance of the new building. Ella looked up. The building was growing taller, and the afternoon sun was reflected in its glass windows and the bay of water across the street. Everything shone with light. Graham watched Ella with satisfaction. She seemed to like it. He said nothing and gestured for her to go into the entryway. The door attendant accepted the key to the car and got into it, taking it into the structure's underground garage. The pair approached the elevator, the doors of which seemed to be made of glass. Everything was transparent that Ella, afraid of heights, looked timidly at Graham. "Is it safe here?" He replied, a little pleased that there was still something she was afraid of. "Well, I have been living here for a few years now, and as you can see, I am still alive," he said with some irony. The young woman was embarrassed, but as soon as the elevator doors opened, she decisively stepped inside first, leading her dog with her. Graham also entered the elevator, dragging a little by the leash of the second dog, who, like Ella, was afraid of the transparent elevator cabin. They arrived on the floor where Graham's apartment was located. Graham walked up to the chic finished doors of his apartment. Classy, it was chic in a modern way. Two front doors opened wide, like a gate. Graham opened them, and, swinging them fully open, gestured for Ella to come in. A vast living room, decorated in the understated manner of northern Scandinavian countries, opened before the young woman. It was now in fashion. Ella judged it from the fashion magazines she sometimes browsed online. Everything in the room was gray, white, or light neutral. The walls, light-colored oak parquet flooring, light furniture on thin but sturdy legs of softwood, perhaps birch. The soft upholstery of the table did not tear the interior. It did not linger on the eyes, so the room seamlessly transitioned to the luxurious view of the bay before them. The room's huge windows led to a terrace, on which several chaise lounges and awnings were placed against the sun. Ella liked the view, turned to Graham and dabbed his chest with her hand. So this is how you live now. I did not know how you settled in. Where can I place my things? She asked, looking around. Pleased with the impression he had made, Graham led her into the bedroom. The room was huge. A double bed occupied one part, and the other was covered with a fluffy carpet. One door led to the bathroom. This room was finished in a super modern style and equipped with everything a young, wealthy man could wish for. A jacuzzi, a shower with a massive spray over the head, like in old houses, a large mirror with a light around the edges, 2 basins for washing, and lots of cupboards for toiletries. Ella quickly looked around at all this splendor, and suddenly something on the edge of the jacuzzi caught her eye. It was a woman's lacy tanga panties. Ella felt like she was being electrocuted. She quickly stepped away from the hot tub and stood beside her, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to hold back tears of jealousy and frustration. How dare he? He had brought her into his home, where he had recently spent time with another woman. Graham went into the bathroom, looked at Ella, then looked where she was looking. Oh, what a jerk he was. He should apparently, his fan's underpants in plain sight. It was all gone. He could see it, in the look on Ella's face. The young woman turned, walked silently out of the bathroom, and called the dogs to her. She stroked them, and tears of resentment rolled from her eyes and dripped onto their fur. How could he? How could he? She thought, wept tearfully, and could no longer restrain herself. The tension of the last few days, both bad and good, poured out in these tears of resentment and helplessness. Ella did not yet know what she should do about it all. First, she should have agreed to come to his house so quickly. But it would have been better to wait and see if she was ready to spend much time around him again. Was there ever a lot of time? She knew well that his new government service activities meant long absences from home when he was running a critical project. Once again, Ella would have to assume the role of a submissive wife, waiting for her husband on a mission. What was left for her in such a life together? Waiting. Not even children, and will there be any more? All this was going through Graham's mind, but he could not tell Ella. So instead, he waited to see what she would do. The young woman finally got up from her squatting position, holding the dog's leashes in her hand, and without looking at Graham, said, still sobbing, "Give me my bag, please." She did not intend to discuss her request. Graham was well aware of that, and handed her the bag. Then, he escorted Ella to the elevator, while only saying once, looking her in the eye, "I am sorry, that was before we got close. It was so sudden. I am sorry." He said it with dignity, and Ella was heartbroken that she was killing their relationship for the second time. Still, he always thought Graham was to blame.
What an idiot I am.
She still loves me. That is why it pains her so much to see proof. I did not expect her back in his life, locked up like a monk. The woman, also finally looking straight into Graham's eyes, said in a firm enough tone and calm, "I am just not ready for what you have had over time, over the years. I am sorry too, for giving you hope it will all come back so quickly. I cannot. I am not ready for a relationship. Even though I am, and..." She hesitated, not wanting to say what was coming out of her mouth, that she still loved him. Graham stood with his hands in his pockets. He tried to contain his impulse to grab her, shake her, and shout, "I love you. Have you not understood that in these 2 days? Nothing else matters anymore." Standing motionless as a statue, he just caught every word she said. Then, finally, Graham realized she was now not saying something important, but decided not to test her patience anymore and just asked, "Do you want a ride, or should I call a cab?" Ella shook her head in the negative, no longer looking at him. The young woman was trying to find the button so that the elevator would close the doors quickly, and she would run away from this torture of opposing feelings for Graham. No need. The door attendant will call a taxi. Goodbye, Graham, she whispered. She finally found it and pressed the button for the first floor. Graham looked down in confusion. The very transparent elevator Ella had been so afraid of carried her away from him. It was over. He had ruined everything. You moron. Chapter 13. When she arrived home, Ella dumped her bag of belongings in the hallway, led the dogs into the living room, and after giving them fresh water and food, went to the terrace. The sight of the park, with the sun now past midday and the clouds floating leisurely in the blue sky, was soothing. The stress of the past few days, good and bad, came over the young woman's shoulders like a heavy cotton blanket. She wanted to lie down in a chaise lounge and, covered with a fluffy blanket, escape into a world of dreams. Everything may be different there. She will have a happy life, and her prince will come to her at last on a white horse. Maybe she will be pleased with him. Ella was almost to the chaise longue, but paused. The thought flashed through her mind that she was surrendering to circumstance. Was it her? She had overcome all the previous occasions. Ella had won Graham's love, had stood the test of character after his disappearance, and had accepted him when he found her again. Ella found the strength to cope with momentary doubts. What about her now? Weakened. Ella turned on her heel, like a stubborn girl who is offered something she does not want. They give her this doll, and she wants the pretty, ornate one. Ella glanced around her apartment. Would she, who had gotten everything she wanted in material terms, give up and let her beloved man back into the arms of some passing maiden? No. We need to ensure Graham is telling the truth, and that his relationship is really a one-off. Who would you like to talk to? Of course, why had it not occurred to her before? The chief. He always knows everything, and now that it was his style to arrange events and watch them unfold. He had brought them together at the jazz club party, though he would not admit it. He could help her figure out what Graham's life had been like before they met. The chief was waiting for news. He was waiting for information specifically about Graham and Ella. Something told him that these young people would still appear on his horizon and have a good time. Yes, his usual amusement comprised studying and redrawing, in his way, the relationships between people. This concerned both the affairs of business and the surrounding people's affairs. The chief was surrounded by the atmosphere of an omnipotent man. One movement of his eyebrow could change the world. He actively supported this with all his might. If something happened at the corporation where the chief was finishing his last years before retirement, those who could not understand what was happening and what to do about the new situation would ask the chief for advice. He may not have been omnipotent, but he was brilliant. His old-fashioned attitude toward women was his weakness. He genuinely wondered how the world had changed. When he came to the corporation, women had only worked as secretaries. Now, he was surrounded by women of all ages and professions, from the same secretaries, called personal assistants, to directors and department heads, to engineers. Female engineers the chief sincerely disliked but suppressed his feelings. Adapt to the world around you. Otherwise, they will throw you in the trash, he thought, as he took another mentor under his wing. He never learned to respect women in technical and business fields, but knew how to hide his disdain. Creating an image as a patron of all the newcomers to the company, the chief thus spent a lot of time with the young people and liked it. His son had long since grown up and lived his own life, and his wife, who, after marrying him, did not work a single day. He provided for the whole family, but now he was getting increasingly bored at home and wondered what he would do in retirement. Different thoughts came into his head, but none of the ideas remained for long. As for Ella, he was struck by her ability to captivate Graham, to enthuse him in a way no one had ever imagined. His success so captured Graham that he left the company and went to work in another field, which the chief assumed was far more complicated and potentially dangerous than running a business. The chief had missed Graham in recent years. In the chief's opinion, he had no one else to compete with because the new business leader was no match for Graham. However, the chief kept his opinion to himself. It was dangerous to share it with others, so there were no friends in companies, only rivals. The chief sometimes thought about the fact that he had almost no friends. Well, some were dead. Some were so far away that one phone conversation a year would not bring back the joy of communication, which at such a distance was also very expensive. Someone is retired and dedicates all his time to family and grandchildren. Since the chief was still actively working, he had no free time outside the work week. He spent his weekends digging in his small garden and thinking. He even thought about writing a memoir, but then he had second thoughts. How would he show the people he had worked with for years and years there? He would be hung upside down by his feet if he showed his proper attitude to too many of his colleagues in his memoirs. No, he cannot write his memoirs. But then what? What to diversify his life with? That question remained unanswered for now. The chief was waiting for those couple of years before retirement to pass, and he would leave the corporate world behind. Then something worthwhile would come to mind, and he would restart his life anew. It was at such a moment that Ella called him. "Hello, good afternoon. Do you recognize me?" "Yes, I did." "Good tribute, Ella," replied the chief. "So, what brings you to the telephone receiver on the other end of which you now hear my voice?" As always, his voice was a mixture of sarcasm and interest in what was going on. Ella, smiling, said, I want your advice. Could we meet and, for example, have coffee this afternoon?" "Tonight?" "Yeah, I could come to the cafe on the corner of our street. Well, you remember where I used to buy you a cup of coffee?" Ella, almost jumping for joy, answered quickly. "Of course, I remember. Is 12:00 okay then?" "Yes, that will do. Do you still remember our lunchtime?" Ella laughed. "Well, how could I forget that, my first job?" Here, she hesitated, and the chief continued for her. "And your first love?" "Yes. See you later. I will wait for you at the cafe." They said their goodbyes, and Ella looked around happily. She would not live in worry. She would find reliable information about the relationship between Graham and the woman who had left her underwear in his apartment. The chief, as usual, leaned back in his old swivel chair almost to the end, rocked in it as in a chaise lounge chair, and throwing his long thin legs on the desk with his hands behind his head, smiled instead, smiling. Life itself brought him surprises, and just when he was very bored. But for now, something interesting awaited him. Ella would not turn to him for anything. She was an accomplished businesswoman and had not needed such advice from him for a long time. Her question was probably about Graham. Perhaps the chief will get his hands on something boiling, which will amuse him greatly. The meeting with Ella was still a couple of hours away, and the chief gathered his thoughts and switched to his work, staring at one of the many monitors that littered his desk. However, his thoughts kept returning to Graham and Ella. What had happened there? Something had happened, and he was about to find out. Chapter 14. Graham was pacing around his luxurious apartment. His gaze fell on a vase of a famous designer made of Graham's particular order, for Ella. He remembered that when he had brought Ella to his mansion as his wife, he first noticed that Ella had lovingly arranged flowers cut in his garden into all the vases of his house. So he thought of a way to please her. The vase he ordered was for her. The vase was a frosted glass sculpture of a woman holding a large basket into which water could be poured and flowers placed. Graham could have appreciated the elegance of the composition. Still, Ella was delighted with the vase itself and that Graham had bothered to give it to her and had placed an order for a gift. Graham stared at the useless vase, his gift to the woman he loved. Suddenly, the wave of rage grew in him with every minute he spent in this apartment without Ella swept over him. His eyes darkened and the vase flew crashing to the floor. It was followed by all the knickknacks next to it, small, unnecessary but beautiful things with which the designer had decorated his interior. He needed nothing without Ella. Nothing. It was all tinsel if you do not have someone who loves you around. Graham liked the feeling of liberation from things that reminded him of his failures. He raked and shoveled off the living room's tables, windowsills, and shelves. Anything that could be dropped. Finally, in his rage, Graham saw a release. Liberation from the feeling that he had given in to the momentary desires of the flesh and missed out on something more substantial, his choice, his Ella. Finally, Graham stopped. The doorbell rang insistently, bringing him to his senses a little. Without looking back at the splintered and scattered floor, he stepped over the piles of debris, walked to the apartment door, and opened it without looking through the peephole. Graham was amazed at their door attendant and one of the elderly neighbors who lived downstairs. When asked if he was all right and if the police should be called, Graham answered in the negative. When he saw their consternation and bewilderment, the man realized he had overreacted and would have had to vent his anger elsewhere. Still, it was too late to think about it now. Having fixed his jacket in a hoarse voice, Graham apologized to his roommate and door attendant for the inconvenience and promised it would not happen again. The door attendant and the old woman looked at him in bewilderment. Then, when he said he had lost his temper because he had parted with his sweetheart, the woman's eyes lit up with pity and sympathy for such a handsome man who was alone. The door attendant shook his head understandingly and pityingly pressed his lips as if to say, "Oh, these women, they do what they want with us men." The commotion Graham had made had no grave consequences, no police. The incident brought him to his senses and spurred him to action. "I just wanted to let you know there is no need to wreck the place. We must get on with business. Perhaps the best way to dull the worries was to immerse ourselves in work." Graham picked up his cell phone, dialed his boss's number, and asked, "Are you not tired of waiting for me? I am free." Chapter 15. Ella parked in her sports car in the most visible spot in front of the corporate building, which she had recently given the middle finger. Well, there it was again. Why had the chief suggested she meet here? However, she had nothing to complain about. She would tolerate it. After all, she requested help, and he chose the meeting place. Ella gracefully got out of the car and walked away from it to the cafe on the corner across from the corporation building. It was the same cafe where the corporation employees liked to spend their time over a coffee brewed by a barista. It was usually those last 15 minutes of the lunch break that one wanted to spend still outside the corporate building. The chief stepped out of the main entrance of the corporate building and strode toward the cafe. His long, light-colored coat fluttered in the light breeze. Beneath the coat was the usual yellow jacket of quality wool, but it always looked like a hastily thrown-on robe, so thin was the chief. The chief's completely gray hair also fluttered in the wind. Anyone who did not know him might have said this was what some weirdo professor looked like. But he was not a professor, and he was not a weirdo. Every action and word of the chief was dedicated to his goals, to learn new information, to analyze it, and to profit from it. He would give any intelligence agency a head start, and many would admit it. Ella had already ordered 2 cups of aromatic cappuccino and 2 croissants for herself and Chief. She remembered his preferences very well. When she came to this corporation and was becoming acquainted with everything new to her, she was firmly associated with Chief and Graham. Yes, Graham. Now, Graham was the reason she was meeting with the Chief. It was up to her to tell the Chief and see his reaction. Ella rose from the table and, smiling happily, offered her hand to the Chief for a handshake. He was not in his style, because he usually avoided touching women with whom he worked for fear of being accused of harassment. Suddenly, he put his arms around her and held her tightly with both hands. Ella was shocked at this display of his feelings. She thought his interest in her had always been that she was interested in Graham, and the Chief realized this as soon as he saw them side by side. He saw Ella's confusion and Graham's interest in her. They sat down at a small round table. Around them were the Chief's colleagues, who greeted him briefly when they met his eyes and watched interestedly whom he was sitting with and talking so kindly. Everyone knew the Chief did nothing for nothing. One thing came to mind when they saw him in the company of an unfamiliar, plainly dressed but well-groomed young woman who occasionally glanced at her bright red sports car outside the cafe. The Chief was up to something new, and he had a mistress outside the corporation. No one thought so. They were all used to the fact that he did not even hug the women with whom he had worked for years and years. The Chief sat looking at Ella. She had changed. Her cheeks were no longer as plump as they had been a few years ago when she worked for them, and Graham had seen her. Ella had changed a little outside, but the Chief could see that she was still the same on the inside, open, determined, and friendly. Yes, no poor wonder Graham had a crush on her. It was so funny to watch from the outside as she had given him the turn of the gate. He did not know what to do about it. The first woman, who was proud of herself, pointed him to his place, the place of just a man, not a billionaire owner and head of an international corporation. The Chief was the first to discuss the case that brought Ella to him. So what happened? Ella set her cup of coffee on the table and pulled back in her chair slightly, lowered her eyes and breathed. We broke up. The Chief stared at her in surprise. So you were already together? He sounded genuinely surprised. They would hit it off so fast. Before he knew it, he had taken Graham to that party at the jazz club, and lo and behold, they were back together, and broke up. He has a knack for creating situations. He has got a lot of fun to be had. The Chief, secretly rubbing his hands with pleasure at the impending story, shook his head sympathetically. Yeah, that is how it happens. So what happened? Ella briefly, without intimate details or conveying the romanticism of the situation, recounted to him only the facts. She told the Chief how she and Graham had spent time together in the countryside, and realized afterward that Graham had someone else. The Chief was not expecting this development and acts in surprise. Is there or was there? What are you talking about, exactly? Ella looked painfully into his eyes, looked away again, staring at the cup of coffee she was twirling in her hands, and answered. That is what I do not know. I was so upset that I could not listen to what he was saying. I did not want to know the details of his relationship. Of course, I cannot imagine a man like him spending those years after we broke up without women. Why did he find me again? Why did he not make sure he cleaned up the mess of another woman in his life? Who is she? That is what I do not know. But I want to find out. The Chief looked at her in surprise. But why are you asking me to know such intimate things about Graham? I do not believe that even in the frankest conversation, he will explain anything to me. We are not friends, only former colleagues. Ella looked pleadingly at the chief. You can find anything you want. I believe in that. I have no one else to ask for help with such a delicate matter. I want to find out if what Graham said is true. I want to know if this relationship was temporary and ended before he had me back again, or not. So he says and apologizes for everything before we meet, but I do not believe him. I cannot believe him. Not yet. I kindly ask you to find out how he lived before we met at the jazz club. Will you help me with that? There was despair in Ella's voice, and tears welled up in her eyes. The chief looked at her, amazed at the display of her feelings. She is a hardened businesswoman, and she is crying in front of everyone, and it is all because of Graham. Yes, she loved him so much that she would set aside all her preconceptions about propriety and come to him for help. The chief knew Ella had no warm feelings towards the corporation, and had even assumed earlier that she did not like him. The chief was very pleased with his discovery. Her addressing him raised his self-esteem so high that he looked around proudly. However, no one noticed that this lovely young woman was crying. Well, that is all right, and it is unnecessary. It is enough that he sees it. The chief reached across the table to Ella and touched her arm lightly. Calm down, Ella. I understand now how important this is to you. I will try to find out what Graham thought of his life before this meeting with you. I can tell you right now that he was looking to meet you. There at the jazz club. He asked me to arrange for him to come to the club so that you would not suspect that it was not a chance meeting. Ella threw up her teary eyes at the chief in surprise, which now immediately brightened with wonder and hope. He was looking to meet me himself. Him. The chief replied. Yes, himself. It was not an accident. So just know one thing, he cares about you. I cannot tell you how much. It is so relative in our lives. He needs you. He does. The chief realized he needed to end the conversation as they attracted more and more attention from the surrounding people. Well, I have to get back to work. As soon as I know something, I will let you know immediately. Be sure of that. Just do nothing foolish, quit your passions and wait for my information, he said. With these words, Chief stood up, waved goodbye to Ella and left the cafe. The young woman sat for another 5 minutes, got up, and went to her car. When she sat down in it, the eyes of all the corporation employees were fixed on her. Everyone was now interested in who their chief was talking to so long and softly. What a new intrigue he was weaving. Because he is always scheming. Chapter 16. Graham was sitting in a car with 2 members of his particular unit, listening in on a conversation with one of the big financial bigwigs in the gray labor market. From their discussion, catching when the criminals intended to transfer funds was necessary. Usually, Graham was not invited to take part in field operations, but now he volunteered. His boss looked closely at Graham as he asked to join the task force he was setting up, and asked, "Are you sure you can handle it? It does not work with computers. It is about taking risks and making quick decisions, sometimes risking your life." Graham looked firmly into his boss's eyes. "I want to do something other than watch money transfer records on a computer screen. I am capable of more. So I will take the risk." The boss looked at him, appreciating Graham's determination and focus, and said, "All right, on my responsibility, you will investigate a group of fraudsters. They are organizing the very money transfers you have been working on lately. Whatever happens can be very tedious, wait hours or days or quick, and then you must react immediately. Talk to the team leader. Here are his contacts. He will be brought up to speed in half an hour, and you can start working in his department. Please remember, your main value to us is your ability to unravel complex financial fraud schemes involving money from large corporations and other large organizations. So take care of yourself, and remember that this job is only temporary. I will not have my best financial transaction expert sitting in a car at the gates of people you can catch just by tracking their transactions. Graham, satisfied with a sigh, cheerfully replied, "Thank you, of course. I understand everything. Right now, I need something more active than a computer monitor. Thank you." Graham turned neatly, army style, on the spot and walked out of his boss's office. Then, finally, he got what he wanted, a more active job. Perhaps this work would help him forget the setback in his personal life and distract him from the sad thoughts of being unable to be together with Ella again. Graham received initial training to work in the intelligence agency's operations team the next day. He was only required to listen to the content of conversations between suspected financial launderers. Graham did not even have to get out of the car in case other operative officers had to take part in active actions to apprehend the suspects. The detention was planned only if it became clear from the wiretaps and recorded conversations of the suspects that all suspicions of criminal activities were justified. This decision was to be made by Graham. Only he knew which phrases in the discussion of these particular financiers could provide a basis for the conclusion that they were involved in criminal activity. The car that went out on such special operations to wiretap and detain criminals was like something out of a spy movie. Everything inside was stuffed with equipment. One specialist was sitting in it, providing wiretapping and recording of conversations of criminals or suspected criminals, and there was room for a couple of other people. The seizure team was in another vehicle. Perhaps there was more aimed at capturing such cars. All this Graham did not know. It was enough for him to realize he was doing something real, raising the adrenaline in his bloodstream. Something that allowed him to stop thinking about Ella and his own life, at least for a while. All the cars were in place. Graham sat in the listening car with another operative. When they received a connection to the devices installed in the room where the money transfer negotiations were supposed to take place, Graham put on headphones and listened intently to the conversation of the three people in the listening room. The talker finally uttered a key phrase that gave away their plans to move money out of the country into fake company accounts in various countries. Graham signaled to a colleague that it was okay to act. He informed the management, and the operatives were permitted to capture the criminals. Events then unfolded at an alarming rate. A group of men busted into the room where the perpetrators were negotiating. However, the perpetrators were armed, and an exchange of gunfire ensued. One perpetrator took cover in an adjacent room and ran out into the street, shooting from the pursuing capture team. Through the darkened window of the car he was in, Graham saw the man, wearing a dark jacket with a gold watch on his left hand, spread his legs wide, extend both arms with a large pistol in front of him, and prepare to fire. One operative from the assault team appeared in the doorway, and a shot rang out. The operative fell and remained motionless. The bullet probably hit him in his protective vest, as no blood was visible. Graham watched the whole thing like it was a slow-motion movie. He hoped the fighter was still alive. Graham realized no one was around, and no one could see that a criminal bullet had hit one operative. Graham looked questioningly at the computer operator sitting next to him, who was already reporting his colleague was wounded to the operation management. Graham looked again at the street and realized that there was still no one on this side of it, and the criminal would just disappear around the corner now. That was all. Graham no longer hesitated, opened the car door sharply, and jumped into the street. The perpetrator, who had almost disappeared from view behind the cars parked on the narrow road, noticed his pursuer and picked up his speed. Both ran as if another runner was waiting ahead of them, waiting for his baton. Graham was well trained, and at over 6 feet, 5 inches in height, his running steps were twice as long as those of a man of average size. Graham almost caught up with the outlaw at the corner of the block, and practically leaping forward, grabbed him by the jacket on the last dash. Both men fell to the sidewalk and rolled around in a struggle for the gun, which the perpetrator had no time to retrieve from his belt. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Graham realized nothing at first, then felt a blow to the chest and froze, holding the perpetrator firmly to the ground. Everything suddenly went dark. Graham could no longer feel his arms and remained lying there. His body was on top of the perpetrator, who was still trying unsuccessfully to get the weight off him. Graham saw nothing else. It was as if all his senses were blurred. His eyes went dark, his ears buzzed, and gradually, it became quiet as if they were covered with cotton wool. Then there was peace. Graham lost consciousness. The SWAT team ran up to Graham and grabbed the man, who was still trying to throw Graham's emotionless body off him. The perpetrator never got the gun out from behind his waist again, but could pull the trigger while Graham tried to twist him off, pinning him to the ground. So Graham got the bullet meant for someone in their Special Forces unit. Or someone else who would try to stop the perpetrator now or in the future. Graham was given first aid at the scene, and after applying pressure to the wound around his liver, helped place him on the stretcher of the ambulance that evacuated him. The emergency room physician determined Graham needed urgent surgery to prevent the possibility of extensive bleeding that occurs when the liver vessels are damaged. Graham was still unconscious. His body was customedly relaxed on the bed for patients in the intensive care unit. The nurses bustled around him, performing the usual actions. They removed his clothes, cutting them off with surgical scissors, washing off the blood that had caked on his torso in large stains, and gluing his shirt to his mighty torso. His long muscular legs were relaxed and stretched out. Graham's face was calm and almost serene, as if he were sleeping. In this condition, Graham was taken to the floor, where emergency surgery was performed. Chapter 17. A call rang in the chief's office. The chief picked up the phone, introduced himself, and slowly put it back on the phone after listening to a short message. Graham had had an accident. One of the chief's acquaintances, who worked at the hospital, recognized a famous billionaire in an unconscious state. He was surprised nobody followed him, relatives, friends, or the press. Something seemed strange to him, and he consulted with the chief, remembering that he had worked under Graham for many years and could tell what the matter was. However, the chief did not comment on the situation. He had long known what Graham had been doing in recent years after he left his position as head of their corporation. The chief gave the information to Graham's mother and Ella. Regardless, the chief understood Ella was the one who needed to be around Graham now, more than any friends. The chief did not go to the hospital to see Graham. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, he picked up his old phone and, looking at the shabby notebook, dialed Graham's mother's number. After briefly informing her of Graham's condition and where he was, the chief was relieved to put the phone down. Graham's mother was a serious woman who did not wail and sob when listening to such a complex message about her son. Instead, she was silent for a moment, then she took a deep breath and asked briefly in a stifled voice what hospital her son was in. The chief dictated to her the number of the hospital's emergency room and, wishing her well, said goodbye. The next call was to Ella. The young woman picked up the phone and, hearing the chief's voice, greeted him cheerfully. Still, he interrupted her, informing her in a severe tone that Graham was in bad condition in the hospital. Ella was silent. The chief was also quiet, waiting for her reaction to the message. Finally, Ella spoke, articulating, as if she were talking to a child or an old man. Or as if she could barely unclench her sobbing lips. She asked for the address of the hospital. Nothing more. The chief also dictated the hospital address to her, and told her to hurry if she wanted to know about Graham's condition, because. Ella asked him why. The chief answered bluntly that it was because Graham's condition was severe, and he was undergoing surgery. There was a ringing tone on the phone. Ella hung up without saying goodbye. The chief, still rocking in his chair at his desk, contemplating the wall opposite on which hung someone's dictum, "Everything in life passes. Only love lasts forever." He used to think it was a joke, so he left this sticker in his office. It was given to him by young employees, for whom the fact that their boss's office would have the word love in it was a big joke. The boss left this inscription in his office to have something to talk about, and what to hurt the new arrivals to work with young people. Well, those young people are only interested in love, the chief thought sometimes. But unfortunately, he was only interested in power. Now he felt how he missed the days of his youth, when the word love still meant something to him. Ella was speeding through the city streets in her sports car. For her luck, nothing had happened to her or anyone around her in such a rush. In addition, the police did not stop her. Finally, arriving at the parking place, the young woman pulled up in front of the hospital where Graham was. Well, she was there and Graham was somewhere here. She was right beside him. Ella parked the car flat, put the handbrake on deliberately calmly, and, freezing for a moment in the driver's seat, stepped firmly out of the car and walked toward the main building of the hospital. Chapter 18. Entering the hospital's main lobby, Ella went to the information desk. She asked the nurse sitting there how to get to the ward where Graham Anderson was. The nurse replied that a patient with that name had been taken to the operating room that day. Ella looked around in confusion. She suddenly felt that it was not real, that Graham was about to appear, perfectly healthy, in the hospital aisle over there and come up to her and hug her and tell her it was all nothing, just a scratch. Ella did not know what kind of problem he had and why he was in surgery. The nurse explained nothing more to her, referring to the fact that she could not find Ella in the patient's next of kin records. Ella replied briefly that she was an ex-wife and had a right to know what was wrong with her ex-husband. The nurse, however, did not give up and only advised Ella to speak with the head of the intensive care unit, where Graham was likely to be taken after surgery, if Ella still intended to wait. The surgery could take an indefinite amount of time, minutes or hours. It depends on the condition of the patient. With a gunshot wound, anything is possible. Then Ella just opened her mouth, unable to get a word out. The words stuck in her chest, and her breath hit her like an iron hoop. "What gunshot wound?" exclaimed Ella. She thought he had been in a minor car accident, and it would have been easy. Oh God! Graham could die. Suddenly, someone gently touched Ella's shoulder. Ella turned around and froze. Graham's mother was looking at her, her face sharply wrinkled. The women threw themselves into each other's arms. Ella was crying profusely. Graham's mother just stroked her shoulders and back, not knowing whether she was comforting Ella or herself. The older woman was not crying. Her eyes were dry. Graham's mother was holding on for her son's sake. Her tears would help nothing now. She said quietly to Ella, "Ella dear. Our Graham. He is so ill. But we must be strong and pray for his health." Ella, gradually calming down, was still hugging Graham's mother and answered nothing. The older woman could feel Ella's body shaking as she tried to cope with her feelings and sobs. Finally, Ella calmed down and, wiping her eyes from her tears, mumbled, "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for him." Graham's mother moved slightly away from Ella and looked at her in surprise. Ella continued, "I should have told him that I still loved him. Everything would have been fine. Now, I can never forgive myself for being selfish, for not believing his true feelings." Graham's mother looked at Ella understandingly, still not letting her out of her arms. Then, finally, the older woman intoned, "Nothing. Sometimes we cannot do anything about what has been. But as long as we breathe, there is always hope that we can change the future. Come with me if you want to see it, or at least wait for the outcome of the operation. Come with me." The women walked through the long corridors of the hospital, holding hands. No one dared to stop Ella, seeing that the patient's mother took her by the hand and led her to the waiting room near the operating room. There they sat for 2 hours, and no one told them anything about Graham's condition. Then, finally, one of the young surgeons came out and, after examining the room, firmly went to Ella's mother. "Your son. Are you Graham Anderson's mother?" Graham's mother stood up and nodded silently. "Your son is fine. The surgery went well. Apart from the liver, other internal organs are not affected, and the liver will gradually recover. I hope that the significant blood loss will not affect the recovery time. He is a strong young man. He will hope for the best." Ella also stood up, but remained slightly behind Graham's mother, frantically clutching her purse strap. The young woman hesitated to ask for details about Graham's injury. But for now, it was enough for her to know that he was alive and might soon be on the mend. The doctor continued, "You can approach him in half an hour when we have ensured his body tolerates all the interventions normally. After that, I would not advise to talk to him. He is still too weak. He needs to rest and regain his strength." Half an hour later, the women were led to the ICU room where Graham was. Ella saw her loved one lying on the bed, which seemed too small for him. Seeing Graham's sprawled body, chest and stomach wrapped in bandages was painful. The shadow of his long, dark lashes washed over the area around his eyes, instantly dimming the circles under his eyes. Yet a pale face was calm. Sensor wires were connected to his chest and fingers. The breathing machine was ready but not hooked up, as Graham could already breathe alone. The nurse explained to Ella that the patient was unconscious, and it was now from the medication, not from the shock of the wound. Ella could not get near him before Graham's mother did. The old lady stood there, looking at her son with pain and joy that she could see him, and that he was alive. How could he be? Why couldn't he sit in his office? That is my son in search of a new meaning in life. The only hope now is that he recovers. Then, all his studies can wait. He will be in my hands now, in the hands of his loving mother. Soon Graham's father would arrive, summoned from his ranch where he had spent time alone, and I could care for my son while he recovered. Suddenly, one device at the headboard of Graham's bed emitted a sharp whistle, and something harnessed there. The smooth line running on the monitor suddenly changed and became intermittent. First, a nurse ran into the room, then a second, a young doctor, probably an intensive care physician, quickly entered. Looking at her son with fright, Graham's mother and Ella stepped back, both stood frozen in the room's corner. A group of resuscitators fussed around Graham, and suddenly one of them said, turning to the women, "What blood type are you?" "Mother," Graham quickly replied. "AB." The doctor shook his head and shifted his gaze to Ella. "Are you related to him? Are you?" Ella immediately responded, exclaiming, "Oh my God! Yes. I am. I am his girlfriend and ex-wife." The doctor looked at her for a few seconds. Then he said, "It is okay. The patient needs an urgent blood transfusion. He must have lost too much blood before the operation. We could stop the bleeding, but we do not have enough O-type blood supply, and he is O-type. He needs a refill right now, and it is urgent. Can you give him your blood? Do not worry, it is safe for you. We will make sure you are okay. This is a matter of life and death for Mr. Anderson. Ella looked at the doctor, confused. She was confused, not because she would have to give her blood to Graham. Instead, she suddenly realized that she might lose him forever, since he suddenly got a complication even after a seemingly successful operation. Ella stepped forward decisively and said in a firm voice, "Please tell me what to do. I am ready." The nurse called Ella into another room, giving her a quick blood type and rhesus test. Everything matched what Ella remembered about her blood type, and the young woman was led back to Graham's room and placed on the bed, pushed up against him. Ella lay perfectly still, looking at Graham sideways as the nurses inserted her arm into the blood catheter and connected its tube to the blood tank from which it would be transfused. His face was ashen. However, Ella no longer felt the helplessness that had gripped her when she first saw him in the hospital bed. Ella knew now that she was doing something for him. She was doing what she could to keep him alive. Ella had not thought that he might be permanently disabled, so powerful he looked, lying in his hospital bed and unconscious, but the possibility of death now touching him with a dark wing, and Ella could almost physically feel it. She needed to melt that darkness over him with her love, and give him a new life by transmitting her power with her blood. Somewhere in the back of her mind was the thought that this was important to them, just that he would live now. There was no doubt about that. That even her blood matched him, something she had never known before. Who was in everyday life thinking about what blood type and Rh factor your lover has? Perhaps only when there is a question about children, whether it is positive or negative for the potential parents of the child. Oddly enough, when Ella lost the baby, she and Graham never went to research what caused it. Ella could not do it, even though Graham suggested she do. Then Ella could not take care of their future. She had passed out and did not have the strength to bear the possibly bad news about her and Graham's future children. For example, if they never exist. Or if carrying a child would be difficult, if both were Rh negative. Yes, she gave up then. Now she has not. Now she knew she had to go all the way. If the doctors demanded it, now Ella would give Graham all of herself, not just blood, only if there was anything she could do to help him. Meanwhile, a tourniquet was put on Ella's arm. An experienced nurse found a vein in her arm and placed a needle with a catheter connected to it by a long transparent tube. A dark red liquid slid down the pipe with another sweep of the nurse's hand. It seemed to Ella that when her blood flowed into Graham's vein, some expression appeared on his face. Maybe it was just tears covering Ella's eyes, tears of hope, tears she did not even want to hide from anyone. The nurse looked at Ella questioningly. But, realizing that Ella was crying not out of fear but out of hope to see the result, the nurse returned to her observation of the monitors. Ella needed to remember how long this blood transfusion took. When the wait was over, Graham was still lying motionless. Still, the doctor who examined him nodded his head in satisfaction and told Ella, "There you go. I hope Mr. Anderson is going to be okay now. Everything went fine. You will now be taken to another room and prepared to leave the clinic on your own feet. It is okay if you feel weak. You will be given everything you need to make it disappear. Thank you, well done. Not everyone would dare to do such a procedure. Good luck to you." With these words, the doctor patted Ella on the shoulder of her arm, which was not involved in the blood transfusion. Ella was taken to another room, where two nurses fussed around her. Ella was barely aware of what was going on around her. She was fine, she knew about that. What would happen to Graham? When would she get any news of his condition? Graham's mother walked into the room. The elderly woman wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and, approaching Ella's bedside, put her hand on the woman's shoulder.
Ella.
Thank you. Thank you. I never thought I would have to see my son like this. All parents think they have to pass away before their children. That is why it is so scary when your child is like this, lying motionless, unable to see or hear you. Thank you again for helping Graham. I will never forget it. Ella did not have the energy to answer, so she covered her eyes with a faint smile, as a sign that she had heard and accepted Graham's mother's words. They were not close, but Ella knew that his mother was Graham's ideal woman and mother. He had often said that Ella, whom he fell in love with, was also the perfect woman. So he and Graham's mother were bound not only by his passion, but also by their blood. His mother gave birth to him, and Ella shared her blood with Graham. Graham woke up from oblivion. Everything around him was blue, and only the room's ceiling was white. He tried to get up, but sank back onto the pillow without strength. The headboard of his bed was slightly raised. Graham felt the warmth of someone's hand on his arm, his mother holding and looking lovingly at him. Graham struggled to get his dried lips apart and tried to say something to his mother, but his voice would not work. His mouth ached, and there was a strange medicinal taste to it. His lips were chapped, as if they had a high fever. "What is wrong with me?" Graham said. He almost sounded like he was screaming, but all that came from his lips was a whistling whisper. His mother replied, lightly trying to press a hand on his shoulder to keep him still. "You have a gunshot wound. You have been operated on, and you are fine now." Graham, squinting his eyes at her. "Does Ella know? Is she here?" His eyes showed so much hope that he could see Ella now that his mother could not stand it. Though Ella had asked her to promise that she would not tell Graham anything about the blood transfusion, she replied, "Yes, she knows. And now you can be related forever." Graham did not understand what came through her voice. Was it a joke? "What are you talking about?" he asked incomprehensibly, trying to find his mother's hand on the edge of the bed. He touched mother's hand and shook it, making sure it was there and saying something about his kinship with Ella. It was all in reality, not in his imagination. The mother replied, "You needed an emergency blood transfusion. She gave you her blood. I would have done it, but my blood is not a match. I am sorry to hear my mother say that, but it is my destiny. Ella has the right blood type and rhesus. So now you are related by blood, whatever that sounds like." His mother was already smiling at the bewildered Graham, who could not imagine having Ella's blood in his veins now. Graham leaned back exhaustedly on the pillows, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Well, it is destiny." He was quiet for a moment, and then added, "Mom, I want to see Ella. Where is she? Can you bring her to me?" "No, honey, I cannot right now. She left right after being brought back to normal, after the blood transfusion. She took a taxi and probably went to her house. Where else? Get well, and things will work out for you again. I am sure of it now." Graham's mother was wrong. Ella took a taxi and drove home, but having hastily gathered up the dogs, she called another cab and left. No one knew where she was going. Chapter 19. Ella sat in the back of the roomy taxi and looked out over the fields, running through the car window. The city was far behind her. The Pomeranians were nestled on a blanket over the car seat to protect them from their fur and claws. Occasionally one would jump up and sneeze, then look around happily to tell everyone, "There, now my nose is all right." Dogs loved traveling and spending time in the car, especially if their beloved owner sat quietly beside them and stroked their fur. Ella looked out into the distance. She did not seem to see anything because everything was floating, merging into one yellow canvas. It was the wheat and other crops ready for harvest. Gold was the color of the coming fall. The taxi driver initially tried to talk to his passenger, this attractive young woman with 2 dogs, but then realized that her thoughts were elsewhere and turned on soft music. Ella was on her way to the chief's ranch. First, she needed some time alone to sort out her feelings. Then, the young woman needed to plan what she would do next. Even though a wave of love and emotion had swept over her at Graham's wounded bedside, the young woman was unsure now that what she had done meant anything to Graham. Perhaps it meant something, but simply as a gesture of help. Yes, maybe he would offer her friendship, only friendship. However, was Ella ready to start over with him again, as he had wanted a couple of weeks ago? Graham was not prepared to distinguish between his past life and the women in it because he intended to get back together and start a family with Ella. Graham was on the mend. The best physiotherapists for recovery from surgery worked with him. Every day, Graham's strength came in, and he enthusiastically followed all their instructions and exercises. The young body's muscles were recovering well. Graham was already walking in the hospital corridors with only a slight hold on the wall. The nurses were fascinated by him. Many of them understood he was not their bird of flight. He was only there until he could fly free. And so it was. Graham recovered quickly from his injury. He was discharged from the hospital to his home under the supervision of his mother and the doctors who visited him in his luxurious apartment. Every day, Graham thought about Ella. He was sure that Ella loved him despite past painful moments in their life together, and her resentment of him for bringing her into his apartment to live together. These thoughts strengthened him, and Graham exercised as intensely as his physiotherapists allowed. It seemed unbelievable to him that his body did not obey. Graham moved the movements repeatedly, and gradually he could get his arms and legs to move confidently. His gait became more stable, he could even laugh a little, and the wound on his stomach was not causing him sharp pain. It was all part of Graham's new life. However, Ella was not in it, not yet. Graham needed to recover to see her and be normal, in his mind of course, strong, handsome, and confident. In the meantime, he was unsure how to take the next step. No, he did not want to appear in front of her again in that state. It was enough that Ella had seen him completely helpless there in the hospital. That she had given him her blood had caused Graham both a sense of gratitude and a sense of shame. A big man, taller than Ella by 2 heads, got from her what he would have been honored to give her, his life, his blood. She gave it all to him, and as usual disappeared in an unknown direction. There was déjà vu about it. He had already rushed to look for her once before and found her in Montreux. Where was she now? Soon, he would be ready to face the front, if only to thank her. She would not escape him so easily. The blood now bound them, her blood. Another day, Graham called the chief when he felt he could move alone. "Hello, it is me." He did not need to say anything else. The chief recognized him immediately, and saying hello, acts in a slightly mock-cheerful voice. "So, how is it going? Are you on the mend?" Graham quickly answered yes, and shifted the conversation to the topic he wanted. "Do you have any idea where Ella might be? She is not answering my calls. I need to find her." The chief, clearly pleased to be back in the middle of such a fascinating adventure as Graham's personal life, importantly muttered. "Of course I know. I always know everything. It is unclear why you, Graham, work for the Secret Service." There was an open irony in the chief's voice. He continued, realizing that Graham was now willing to listen to any of his introductions to learn something about Ella. She rented my ranch. You remember, the one 100 miles from our metropolis. Yeah, she should be there now. At least she was there a week ago. She called me to check on closing the barn. Graham was still silent. He was waiting for more clarification. The chief continued. I do not believe she wants to see you. If she did, she would see you when you left the hospital. But as it is, I guess she is dealing with her feelings and her life. The chief, pleased that he had such a rare opportunity to teach Graham about life, grinned. Forget them, these young people. They understand nothing in life. In addition, for him, the only thing that matters now is a stable and good income, his old wife and his son's life. However, his son did not want to listen to his father's teachings, so the chief was now getting even with Graham. I think she needs to rest from everything happening in your life lately. She was exhausted when she came to me. Perhaps she had not quite recovered from that procedure yet. Graham roared into the tube. Thanks, but enough. I know what happened to her myself. Then he came to his senses and continued in a conciliatory tone. Thank you for the information. It is always invaluable. You know how to learn everything and always know everything. You do not have to tell me everything straight out. But thank you for the information and goodbye. Graham hastened to hang up lest the chief continue the conversation about Graham's private life, which had become dangerously enlightening. He was not asked how to behave with Ella, only where she was. Graham can handle the rest on his own. Now he has something to do. Half an hour later, a limousine arrived at Graham's condominium. The driver got out of the car and opened the passenger compartment door. A tall man in elegant but simple clothes appeared at the entryway door of the house. Brown boots, loose blue jeans with a classic cut, gray sweater, with the collar of his shirt, also blue with small checks unbuttoned from the triangle collar. Yes, Graham could walk on his own now, without the support of the walls. He stepped out of the driveway, keeping a little too straight, and got into the limousine. The driver looked to see if there was any luggage, but Graham shook his head negatively. No, let us go. The limousine started smoothly and raced away from the city. Graham had not hoped for more than just a conversation with Ella. He had so many feelings for her. He needed to see his loved one and thank Ella for what she had done for him. Although she was seriously resentful of his promiscuity in arranging her personal life. Graham knew Ella was a grown woman and hoped she would understand that a man always needs a woman by his side. Chapter 20. Ella stood on the shore of the lake and watched the sunset set over the water. No soul was around except for her faithful dogs, nestled at her feet, wondering what interested their mistress in the water. The mist thickened over the lake. Cold evening air mixed with the warm air from the water warmed during the day. Fall was approaching. Ella watched the water gradually turn orange, and then the crimson color of sunset. The fog turned the spectacle into a spectacle of sorts. Ella watched as a spectator sitting in the audience, staring at the stage illuminated by the multicolored spotlights of a skilled illuminator. Pictures of sunrise and sunset had always fascinated Ella. So now Ella, the young woman, watched as the sun said goodbye to her and the world around her to rise again tomorrow. Therefore, Ella saw off and started anew every day on this vacation. A vacation from everything. From her city apartment, from her regular life, from Graham. She thought, well, here. Everything superfluous disappeared, leaving only what mattered to her. Graham was on her mind every day. He never left her side. Graham was there for her all the time, all the time. The dogs suddenly perked up and stood with their leashes taut. One of them barked, then the other. A beast or a man was approaching them, in the fog. Ella froze, not knowing what to do. Finally, she just stared at the hillside where someone was walking. She could tell it was a man by the heavy footsteps and the slightly labored breathing of the outstretched walker. The woman gazed intensely into the fog and suddenly saw the familiar silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man, and her heart rejoiced. Then she saw his face. Yes, she was not mistaken, it was Graham. He was strolling toward her down the hillside. Ella let go of the dog's leashes, and the dog squealed happily and rushed toward Graham. He continued walking toward Ella without stopping. The woman stood with her without trouble, limply, gazing into his face. He looked pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He was walking, and he was pacing himself. He was going to her. When Graham approached Ella, he paused, hesitant to come close to her. Ella stepped toward and embraced him, pressing her face gently against his chest. She hesitated to hug him tighter. She remembered that his scar from the wound might be where her heart was now beating. Graham pressed her against him in a way that made her groan, too sharply, but he wanted her so much. He wanted to see her, to feel her. He wanted to possess her. The lovers stood in each other's arms for a long time. They did not need to talk, but they still needed each other. They loved each other. The sun went down, and everything went dark. It did not matter to them. The eternal fire of love burned in their hearts, passionate love, all-forgiving and illuminating. The end. Series to be continued. The next book in the series is The Christmas Gift, a Billionaire Boss Romance. As the Christmas holiday season approaches, the loving couple, an arrogant billionaire Graham Anderson and his beloved ex-wife Ella, plan to spend it together. Both dream of the ultimate gifts, happiness, and a bright future in their complex relationship. Graham wants to propose again and rushes to find the perfect gift for Ella. However, fate has its plans for their Christmas. Read now. The Christmas Gift, a Billionaire Boss Romance.